Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is The Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 51, Glaucus. X. The med bay in their base camp was small and smelled heavily of antiseptic. Ichigo didn't necessarily hate the place, but his desire to be on the fields with his men, or really anywhere but under the watchful eye of a healer, combated any love he could have for the place. Ichigo shifted on the cot and hissed as he pulled at one of the stitches that stretched from nearly his hip to his ribcage. It was quite nasty, or so Shinji had said with a satisfied grin. Ichigo had little comparison considering his definition of nasty was closer to being torn nearly in half. It had been a lucky slip really. He had been fighting Grimmjow, the aggressive excitable cat, and then Zaraki had appeared like a chariot of hellfire, and Grimmjow had been joined by Neliel, and the rest was a blur of chaos. Ichigo didn't want to try and untangle. He knew that the medic who had treated the wound, Tsuyu, if he remembered the frankly frightening woman correctly, had wanted to send him home, probably because she didn't want to deal with him, and also because of the severity of the wound. But he had dissuaded her, eventually, stating he needed to be there if another battle occurred. He was a captain. To assure victory he had promised to stay in the med barracks. He may or may not have crossed his fingers. The young man had also pulled the old wizard fast healing excuse, which Shinji had happily vouched to in a way that had the healer doubting the two of them but consented anyways, likely so she wouldn't have to deal with the two anymore. Shinji could be an annoyance on a good day, but trap him in a room with little to nothing to do and the man could be a nightmare. He had the absolutely inane habit of beginning to rattle off riddles if one wasn't careful. Shaking his head, Ichigo carefully shifted his Shiakusho to the side and glanced at the inflamed skin stretching a line along his torso, the stitches crossing neatly in black thread. It would probably scar, another to add to the collection. With a magnanimous sigh, Ichigo let his Shiakusho flop back to cover his chest. As he squished his head into the pillow, by his estimate he would have a day till he could be on the battlefield once more, but he could probably escape the med bay in an hour if he tried. It was a day too long, a day where he wasn't there to lead the soldiers, to protect everyone. He didn't doubt the abilities of his comrades, not in the slightest. Well, Zaraki couldn't really lead, but that was to be expected. They were all holding their own in battle and within the command tent. They had formed a team, working to balance each other's strengths and weakness while trying to maintain low casualty rates, planning who they would fight, managing the advancing line, and talking with each other. But that didn't deter from the guilt that snatched angrily at his thoughts in the silence of the med barracks. Quiet was violent, a lyric he faintly recalled from some song, one that rang true. In the med barracks there wasn't much to do but sleep and think, and Ichigo was hardly at the point where he was sleeping most of the day, so his body could heal. Instead, it was his thoughts, flashes of the past and present interchanging before his eyes and stealing away his sight as he sat quietly and ignored phantom figures. When he was on the battlefield it was easier to ignore it all, to push it aside and focus on the feel of Zanjutsu in his hands. Even the small amount of downtime he had, that had dwindled since the start of the war, he spent aiding the troops, talking to his fellow captains, or going over the reports with Byakuya. Ichigo knew Anohana would probably have a field day once things quieted, and he was okay with that, mostly accepting it with grace. But that was later, and here Ichigo was in the silence with only the gentle hum of healing and sleeping Shinigami around him. Idly he forced his mind to think of the war, pulling away from thoughts of past injuries and the visits to the fourth that were inevitably in his future. They had been in Hueco Mundo for 3 weeks now. It seemed both a century and a few days at the same time. The first week had been nothing but tension, like the Cold War of the 50s, but with far less spying or nuclear weapons. Then the second week had exploded into bloody chaos, moving forward inch after solitary inch, fending off attackers, and charging into the fray. It was an attrition war at its finest, because Shinigami and Hollows didn't have tanks and aeroplanes, and chivalry was half dead. That second week had mostly been fighting between the Shinigami and the fodder Hollows. Neutra had been the only Espada seen and he had died. Ichigo wondered if that's why they hadn't seen any of the Espada till the third week. It was hard to predict or understand Baragon's movements. The captain of the 10th had stayed away from Los Noches. It was easier to fight that way. Not knowing their plans as clear as glass eased his conscience somewhat. In the most recent week, the Espada had finally escaped their porcelain mansion and onto the fields. It had been a thrill to fight against Tia, Neliel, and Starkey, the three making appearances along with the other Espada as the captains were pulled onto the fields while the fodder soldiers, a name he despised, continued to fight around them. The fighting had raged, sand burning into glass as blood continued to stain the sands in a way that was achingly familiar. They were closer now, Los Noches within easy view, a sharp crease against the horizon. The bodies were sent back to Soul Society for cremation, and Ichigo wrote countless letters to their families, and they continued to fight, reinforcements occasionally arriving, and Shinigami kept dying. The word whispered on the wind was that a force would be attacking Soul Society soon, that soon the Hollows would make their move. It sent a coil of unease snaking its way around Ichigo's chest, stealing his breath. His family was there, Kyan, Rukia, Yukatake, even the Suteiko, and ever the protector. Of course, Ichigo was worried. He knew the war was reaching a climax, the fighting before had been without results, the Espada battled the captains and neither side lost or won, only gaining information and understanding of each other, and the intimate understanding of war. Soon they would be entering Los Noches, and the skeleton on his throne would be forced to surrender or their forces would perish. It was a simple known outcome hanging in the balance as the days and nights continued to pass under the same grinning guidance. Ichigo was mildly hopeful about the survival of the Espada, the ones that possessed the intricate sense of humanity at least. Some of them, the ones he particularly liked at least wanted to stay alive. The Central 46 wasn't around to spew biases and harsh sentences ferreted through the law anymore, and the Suteiko was tolerant at least. He had talked to the other captains as they shared a few flasks of stolen sake. They had been surprised by how human, for lack of a better word, the Espada were. Shunsui had looked so old when he talked of battling Tia and Starkey, and Shinji had already made his decision, lips firmly sealed shut so that they were almost white with grim determination. Kensei was the same, and Byakuya understood ever the hidden empathy. He was hoping most of the captains, when it came time, would spare the Espada. They were dear to him even if he didn't know them as well in the current timeline. They had such potential and brilliant personalities. Their diversity would be a great advantage to the ever-traditional Soul Society. They would bring new techniques, new cultures, ideas, and new opponents of a friendly kind. "How ya feeling there, Ichi?" A familiar voice asked casually with its usual drawl, pulling Ichigo from his meandering thoughts. Shifting upwards on the hospital gurney, Ichigo glanced at the low entrance to the med bay and was greeted with the grinning visage of Shinji, short golden hair like a halo around the wizard's head as the man leaned cockily against one of the support pillars. Ichigo chuckled faintly at the sight and shook his head, refusing to answer immediately, instead beckoning the older captain inside. Shinji's countenance brightened for a moment, so that the man seemed to glow before the captain of the fifth was casually prowling towards Ichigo's bed. "So, Mr. Stuck in the med bay, how are ya feeling?" Shinji asked once more, sliding languidly into one of the small uncomfortable plastic chairs scattered around the med barracks. Ichigo tilted his head in thought for a moment before shrugging, and then hiding a wince at the unfortunate decision, he replied, "Mostly better, stitches should come out soon. It's just the quiet." "Because heaven forbid ya have to sit in the quiet." Shinji snarked back with a raised eyebrow, even as underneath Ichigo could see familiar concern. The man was as much a mother hen as Kisuke. Ichigo grinned at the insinuation, because Ichigo was a man who appreciated the silence, and Shinji damn well knew it. "It's too silent. But now that you're here I won't have to worry, will I?" Ichigo shot back as he grinned at his friend. Shinji leaned back in fake hurt, hands splayed over his chest in offense. Ichigo simply gave his friend an unimpressed stare and rolled his eyes at the man's dramatics. "What, no overbearing division members pop through?" Shinji asked after a moment, arms slung over the back of the chair, and in quick motion, Shinji's feet were on the bed. Ichigo knew the healer would throw a fit, but he couldn't find the empathy in himself to care as Ichigo shook his head and sighed in partial relief and commented, "Nope, I'm just glad no one's sent anything back to Soul Society. Kyan would slay all of Hueco Mundo to get here if he heard I was injured." Shinji laughed, loud and deep, in a way that lifted the spirits, and after a minute Ichigo joined in, ignoring the pain in his sides. Slowly they calmed, the previously oppressive atmosphere of the med bay, lighter. "I can see that happening," Shinji commented with a grin, pausing for a moment. An abashed expression stole faintly over the blonde's features and he continued, "Though I may have mentioned you were in the med bay to Sosuke and Kisuke." Ichigo's heart stopped for a moment of terror, as he prayed to whatever deity above that would listen, that they hadn't shared the news. Kami knew having the healer on his back was trying enough, but Kyan was a helicopter parent at its finest, except everyone was part of his brood. That wasn't even to discount the others. Rukia would hit him, he winced at the thought of the midget's stinging hits, and Ganja would give him those puppy eyes that always made one feel incredibly guilty. Pulling back from his thoughts, Ichigo glanced at Shinji, who was picking at the frayed hem of his Shiakusho. Shaking his head in fond amusement, Ichigo commented slyly, "Couldn't resist the urge to gossip to your boyfriends." Shinji glanced up, obviously happy for a moment that Ichigo wasn't angry, before a scowl twisted his features as he registered Ichigo's words. With a pointed finger, Shinji lectured, "I'll have you know I don't gossip." The captain of the 10th made a vague sound of agreement with an unimpressed look that Shinji once more received with mock offense. After a moment a wicked grin slipped onto the blonde's features as he studied Ichigo. It was the kind of grin that made his eyes light up with infernal fire, and Ichigo silently bemoaned his peace of mind for whatever was coming, even as Shiro chuckled, obviously amused. "Speaking of boyfriends, has dear old sparkly Kukaki come to visit?" the blonde asked innocently. Ichigo shook his head again, and tamped down on the urge to swat his friend, knowing it would be a waste of energy. Instead, he sat a little straighter and replied simply, knowing it would irritate Shinji, who had been hoping to get a rise out of Ichigo. "He visited earlier. I asked him to smuggle in some sake, but well, he's not always perfect." The captain of the 5th doubled over with laughter, blonde hair swaying and parting like liquid gold in the faint light of the med barracks. Ichigo shook his head. Sometimes it wasn't even the funniest things that set Shinji off. After a few moments where the blonde attempted to regain his breath, Shinji sat up, cheeks a rosy red, and eyes bright with mirth. He studied Ichigo for a split second before, with a waggle of his brows and a wink, he pulled out a flask and tossed it to Ichigo. He caught the canteen easily, the sound of liquid splashing playfully inside. With an amused grin, Ichigo flicked back the lid and took a sip, the liquid burning pleasantly on the way down. Tossing the flask back to the blonde, Ichigo received a cocky smile as Shinji questioned, "Who's perfect?" Ichigo tilted his head in obvious thought, one hand reaching to stroke a beard he didn't and would never have. He continued to think about his answer for another moment before assuredly responding, "Why, that would be me, wouldn't it?" Shinji chuckled and reached over to flick Ichigo on the head with an amused murmur of, "Brat." Ichigo swatted at the hand even as Shinji slipped back and took a swig from the flask. Setting it down, the man grinned wicked and wild and asked, "Now who's going to help you escape the med bay?" "Well, I'm sure I could rope one of the members of my division into helping me escape," Ichigo responded with a knowing grin. Shinji gave Ichigo an unimpressed stare in return and responded, But they aren't half as good as I am." "You'd probably get caught." "Probably, but at least I would be sober," Ichigo acknowledged with fake solemnness. Shinji exclaimed in response, "Oi, I bring yasake and this is the thanks I get." The captain of the 10th rolled his eyes at his friend's dramatics and reached over to comfortingly pat the man's arm in a way that wasn't at all demeaning. Shinji studied Ichigo for a moment before he rolled his eyes and passed Ichigo the flask. "So about breaking me out?" Ichigo asked with a curious lilt as he passed back the flask. Shinji stared the orange-haired captain down unamused before he responded, "You're just going to escape soon anyways, aren't ya?" Ichigo nodded. The blonde sighed, "I don't know, Ichi. What's in it for me?" "The satisfaction of pulling one over the head, medic," Ichigo responded and received an unimpressed stare. Shrugging in defeat, Ichigo snatched Shinji's flask out of the man's hand, waved it threateningly and said, "If not bargaining, then how about a hostage situation?" Shinji stared incredulously for a moment before he shook his head and said, "I'm still not busting ya out, Ichi." "Oh well, worth a try," Ichigo said amiably as he handed the flask back, the silver metal catching the light of the tent in sharp slices. Shinji smiled good-naturedly and with a wink said, "But that doesn't mean I can't stay to keep you company." The captain of the 10th just laughed at his friend's antics, ignoring the stitches in his side, and promising to be on the battlefield soon. He would fight to protect them. In the meantime he would listen to Shinji babble about low-caliber Shinigami X. The early evening was quiet, the hum and lull of it settling around Rukia like a familiar blanket. She wanted to tug it closer, to enfold the sense of security that seemed to hang gently around her, but she couldn't, not when there were lives depending on her. The calm of the night was underlain by a deep unseatable lingering tension, one that crackled and licked at her heels as she led the patrol down the narrow empty streets of Seoul society. It occurred to her faintly as shadows shifted with the shuffling wind, that the quiet of the night was not so much light, as a heavy blanket settled over all of them by the lack of presences drifting throughout the streets. Through all of her years living in the outer districts of Rung-Ok, there had always been someone on the streets, some beggar in the corner, shady dealings under a veranda, people stumbling from the bars. But there was none of that tonight, and the silence lingered and swelled in the empty corners. The 5 Shinigami around her could feel it as well. They shifted uneasily, glancing at the buildings that were a dark murky gray in the night, and ripe with shadows. The war was affecting them all. Most of the residents of Seoul society had been advised to temporarily evacuate to the outer districts, which had changed from the poverty-stricken ghettos of her youth, to somewhere people could actually have a decent quality of living. The general thought behind the evacuation was that farther away from the Godi I-13, where all the fighting would occur, would be safer and less likely to attract the attention of the Hollows. Rukia only prayed the Hollows wouldn't be so callous and monstrous under the lead of the Espada as to attack the souls. She knew very easily that it was a prayer unlikely to find fulfillment. Though a part of her was comforted with the information that the patrols of low-level Shinigami and those of the militia were still occurring and patrolling the streets. As Rukia surveyed the streets, eyes picking out the shadows with all the ease of a predator, she idly wondered how Yuka-Take Teiko was. It had seemed as if her captain was balanced on the edge of a wire. With Kiriraku Teiko gone, and the stress of the coming war, Kyan had returned from his impromptu semi-retirement to aid their captain in dealing with the paperwork, but the weight of war was still taking its toll on the kind man. Although she supposed war was taking its toll on all of them. Returning from the mortal realm had been a flurry of debriefings, new responsibilities, and an underlying worry that lingered for Byakuya, Ichigo, and all the other Shinigami fighting as part of the invading force. Not to mention the background worry about the twins, and her own worries and doubts. But Kyan the mother hen, blessed soul he was, had sat beside Rukia and talked, and then she had talked, and it had been a bit better. A noise ahead of them startled the patrol so that they all came to a screeching halt, gazes locked on the darkness that was beginning to gather thickly, like syrup dripping from the horizon and coalescing in great draping curtains. The sound was repeated, like the small clack of something heavy against the cobblestone, and it took Rukia a minute to recognize the sound even as a Shinigami to the left moved to draw her Zanpakuto. Rukia raised a hand, halting their movements as the shadows cleared and a hunched figure appeared. A wagon was pushed forward carrying a great load of crops. The man pushing the wagon was old, white wispy hair gathering around his head in wild spurts. He was joined by a younger man, who carried a katana and the weight of a soldier about him, eyes as unforgiving as the supposed sands of Hueco Mundo. It took Rukia a moment to notice the last member of their party. Sitting in the wagon was a small girl, barely a toddler, all wide-eyed curiosity as the child played with a small scrap of a doll. "What are you doing here? It isn't safe to be wandering these streets at night." The raven-haired Shinigami asked kindly, pitching her voice in a manner that she hoped wasn't intimidating. The old man glanced up with warm eyes, but it was the young man who stepped forward to answer. He bowed his head, sweeping off an old rice hat that had a worn care about it. He stated, "My grandfather is a farmer along the eastern edges of the 58th. He heard of the citizens who were unable to leave, and who were in need of food. He has always been a kind man." The young man trailed off with a fond sort of look before he continued, "I refused to let him go alone. I was part of the militia in my district and decided to accompany him. The child is one that was found abandoned at one of the empty restaurants nearby. It is likely the mother was unable to take care of the babe." The young man finished, eyes a contrite mixture of the hardness born of the weary, and a soft fondness that was directed towards his 2 companions. Rukia knew about families in Rung-Ok. They weren't formed of blood, and she didn't doubt their story, not when she knew what living in Rung-Ok looked like. She had heard of the struggles of those who were evacuating, of those who were stuck in relief camps temporarily and unable to get the sufficient food necessary for those with Reisu. It was a matter she wished could aid more in, but resolved that ending the war as soon as possible would be all they could manage, that and the volunteer work they had been managing in their spare time. The Shinigami shifted uneasily once more, and Rukia ignored the same urge as the feeling of eyes watching them appeared and increased tenfold, sending shivers down her spine. Turning to the 2 Shinigami on her left after a moment of thought, she carefully instructed, "Please lead these 3 to the relief camps situated to the north. Those should be the ones closest to here." Be quick please and be safe." The Kukaki received twin nods, their fear reflected like glass in their eyes but hidden beneath determination and the will to protect their home that had recruited the men in the first place. The small family after a moment of silence moved forward so that they converged with the group, the two Shinigami sharing murmured names under the cover of darkness. Rukia stiffened suddenly as a Jigokuko fluttered out of the darkness, and at the same moment, Reisu exploded into the night in a violent wind that ripped at Rukia's hair and senses like a violent windstorm, the Reisu piercing rain. The female Shinigami took a deep breath, tamping on the instinctive urge to flee at the powerful mixture of Reisu clawing at each other and scraping into the night. Carefully she let the graceful messenger land on her outstretched finger, attempting to project calm to her worried colleagues. As she read the missive, Rukia hid a gasp. Perfect Kukaki mask, one Hisuna had always teased her about, staying firmly in place. Kyan's familiar baritone reported an invading force of hollows, 4 Espada, an unknown quantity of regular hollows, as well as Arrancar. 3 of the Espada were known locations and had been engaged by captains, but one was still missing, and there were hollows wandering the streets. Unconsciously Rukia's hand reached for Sode no Shirayuki's pommel, taking comfort in the icy wave of calmness that surged from the blade, her spirit murmuring soft warnings. Taking a moment, Rukia turned to the small patrol, eyes carefully absorbing the fear decorating the features of the 3 souls who remained huddled together. The hollows have invaded Soul Society. There are 4 Espada, with 3 known locations, and an unknown quantity of hollows and Arrancar. Keep your eyes open, and please get dash. Rukia trailed off as a loud crack split the air behind her. Slowly she turned to watch the air rent itself in two and a dark figure stepped out of the Garganta, flanked by a few hollows. The Espada, for that, was what it was. Rukia could tell from the power choking the air like a viper curled around its prey, was tall, with skin like charcoal, harsh against the meticulous white of its outfit. The Espada was quiet, an almost serene air about the hollow, even as underneath something twisted thrashed in its cage. The hollow glanced around in abject silence, observing its surroundings before his gaze landed on Rukia, and her squad, as well as the souls hidden in the back. A patrol, I did not expect one. The hollow mused quietly to himself, obviously male if the deep voice like the timbre of a drum was any indication. Rukia repressed the sharp shudder tracing her spine as she tried to plot, tried to use the mind she had always been praised for, wondering how they could escape alive. Rukia knew the harsh truth, she wasn't even a lieutenant, there was no way she would be able to defeat the Espada, even with the help of the Shinigami on patrol they still wouldn't make it. But she could try, delay for time until a captain could arrive or another lieutenant. And maybe if she could protect the souls, and delay the Espada, that would be all that would matter. Because if they ran, if they were cowards, then the Espada would be able to go where he pleased. He could attack the innocent citizens of Rungokai, not to mention the small family behind her. And Soul Society would have little to no clue till a report came in. Rukia wasn't a coward, she was scared, more than she had ever possibly been in her life, but she wouldn't abandon Soul Society nor the family behind her. Words echoed in her mind, "You'll come back, and don't die please." Rukia wouldn't die, no matter how impossible the odds seemed, no matter how much she wanted to surrender to a higher force, improbably odds. She would live, she had to, she had promised to return, and she wouldn't break a promise, not on her honor. Without warning, the few hollows gathered behind the Espada began moving forward, great lumbering motions almost unnaturally fast. They were different from the hollows Rukia had encountered before, Reisu thick and heavy around them, and staring cautiously she could see strange designs sprawling over their masks in acrid yellow. Rukia drew Sode no Shirayuki from her sheath with a whisper of metal on wood and yelled to her squad members, "Get those 3 out of here at all costs. One of you report to the Suteiko." The Kukaki let her attention drift away from the patrol, assured they would follow her instructions as she sunk into a low stance, Zanpakuto humming steadily in her hands and Ichigo's voice in her ears. Kyan and Ichigo had been the ones to teach her most of what she knew with Zanjutsu, Byakuya had taught her as well, but they had devoted their bonding time to Kido. Kyan with his water-type Zanpakuto had been ideal for aiding Rukia in figuring out her Shikai. And Ichigo with his experience with Hitsugaya-san and his innumerable talent had been a bonus. The first hollow charged and Rukia let thoughts of the past, evenings in the Kukaki compound, slip away as she stepped forward and sliced through the hollow's mask. Beside her, One of the Shinigami on patrol appeared and sliced through the mask of a hollow with amphibian-like features. Her assertion has been right, the hollows were strong, like the famous hollows they discussed at the academy, such as Grand Fisher, with heavy Reisu and either brute strength, or cunning speed, some hidden employed tactic springing out at the last moment. Rukia was glad there were only 4 of them as she dodged a few flying spikes and slipped under a crushing blow, Sode no Shirayuki slashing upwards to cut through the mask. Rukia and the other Shinigami continued to fight the hollows, trying to reserve their movements and retain their energy. All the while Rukia was peripherally aware of the Espada waiting on the edge of the battle, ever calm and serene like the surface of a lake waiting for the ripples to disturb its peace, watching and observing. When the last of the hollows had crumbled into dust, Rukia paused and turned to face the Espada, chest heaving, even as grim determination filled her veins with adrenaline. Sode no Shirayuki remained poised lightly by her side as she stared into acid yellow eyes, ones that burned like the scorching sun. "You are a worthy opponent. I am Zamarira Rose, the 8th Espada." The Espada stated, and Rukia suppressed any urge to flinch at the revelation, nor to sag in relief that she wasn't fighting an Espada higher than the 5th because she knew her chance of survival had increased incrementally. Mustering her composure, Rukia pulled on the icy Kukaki mask and responded dutifully, "Rukia Kukaki of the 13th Division." The hollow nodded and drew his blade. Rukia almost wanted to thank the hollow for the lack of dramatic rambling, or last-moment wishes and cocky taunting as hollows or really any enemy often participated in, and Ichigo had whined about in many of his correspondences. Though Rukia doubted the battle would cease without any monologuing. The Shinigami behind her shuffled to the far side of the street, clearly understanding that it wasn't a fight he could participate in. The man could aid from the sides, but this was a battle where he would get in the way when he had little experience with Rukia or sufficient skill with the Zanpakuto. Rukia partially appreciated it, and partially wanted to rally the Shinigami to fight with her, so she wouldn't feel so utterly alone against what felt like a giant of an opponent. Sode no Shirayuki whispered softly that Rukia wasn't alone, calm surging through her, freezing her worries and lending the icy numbness of the frost. The Espada was fast, that was the first thoughts as Rukia crouched dodging the overhead swing that would have taken her head off had she been a moment too slow. He was fast but not as fast as Byakuya, who moved as if hell ran through his heels and electricity through his muscles. Rukia was not as fast as her brother, not even close, but she knew how to work around that. She listened to the vibrating hum that the reports had stated signified Sonito, and slid to the left dodging the swing. She let Sode no Shirayuki snap up to crash with the other blade with a grinding screech of metal that sent sparks dancing upon the night air. Coolness wrapped around her hands like icy gauntlets and Rukia pushed against the larger force, a frown of determination pulling at her lips. Rukia flinched as a whisper of instinct snapped at her muscles and she ducked an overhead swing from behind, whipping around to see a twin of the Espada who had fled a few paces. The voice that spoke came from both of their mouths like eerie mirrors, "You will fail because you are Shinigami. The Espada are superior, and Sonito so follows. And I among the Espada have the fastest Sonito. I added in another step and am able to create in a sense clones of myself, a certain magic if you will. I can create up to 5 clones with Gemelos Sonito." And there was the monologue. Rukia mourned silently, trying to think over a new strategy even as she stared icily at the Espada, her peripheral attention extended as once more she caught the whistle of wind signaling an attack. The hollow reversed his blade and began a complex combination of swings, moving his blade like it weighed nothing, slashing overhead, to the left, reversing to stab, before slashing low, and dragging his blade upwards. The twin carefully following the movements and leaving Rukia to rely on her senses and training to stand firm, even as a third clone formed into existence. Rukia carefully swayed around the liquid-like blade, catching it on Sode no Shirayuki and struggling against the Espada's greater physical strength with concentration lining her brow. She felt the clone moving behind her, even as cocky victory filtered through watered yellow eyes, and with a split second of decision, Rukia dropped into a low crouch, the blades crossing overhead. Pushing Sode no Shirayuki upwards from the low crouch, Rukia pierced the torso of one of the clones, before swirling around steadily onto her feet and casting a shakuho that sent the other clone flying backwards, slamming into the misty white of Soul Society's buildings. "Please halt, I will not let you invade Soul Society," Rukia stated, staring the Espada down with ice circulating through her veins and turning her words into glaciers. The Espada studied her for a moment, eyes glaring holes in the darkness before the eighth Espada stated, "You are arrogant to think you are able to stop me. I shall show you the depth of such arrogance. Suppress Brujeria." Rukia braced herself, watching in surprise as the Espada levitated his blade, the metal folding in on itself, before Zomari's head tilted and continued to tilt so that his head rested like it was broken upon his neck. Then a white film-like substance erupted from the Espada's blade, hiding the body from view, and Reisu splashed upon the air with all the force of a tidal wave. When the strange substance finally cleared, Rukia had to resist gawking at the strange creature that had once been the Espada. Eyes surrounded its round, almost pufferfish-like body, the eyes covered near every inch of his body, blinking every second in a way that was definitely not creepy. She could feel a monologue about power coming on because it was seemingly commonplace. Instincts screaming in warning, Rukia darted to the side as one of the eyes glowed purple, the kind of purple that was sickening and made one think of disease and taint. He questioned her movements after nothing visible had happened before he began to explain the nature of his resurrection, the way he could steal sovereignty from all that his eyes saw. As the man continued to monologue, Rukia silently tried to figure a way out of her situation. Her left leg was already compromised, the print standing vividly against the black cloth of her shiakusho, and he would soon use that against her. She knew she would be able to use Flash Step if she immobilized the leg. The question was the best way to do so without causing herself permanent damage. Studying him silently with a blank face that prompted more explanation, Rukia noted the number of eyes and concluded that he could only control so many things as there were eyes, 52 eyes, which meant little relief, though Rukia had another suspicion. The Espada finished his monologue, making a great show of commanding her left leg to move forward. Grudgingly Rukia resisted, even as her leg moved without her command, sliding a step forward. Tamping down on the worry that bubbled like a fire within her chest, Rukia gathered her Ryotsu around her, body temperature lowering steadily and at an accelerated rate, and with a silent breath said, "Dance Sode no Shirayuki," letting the blade swing vertically and watching the familiar transition to Shikai as the ivory ribbon extended, lilting through the air on an unforeseen breeze, and her Reisu pulsed like a heartbeat in her ears. Without preamble, Rukia let ice encase her right leg, hidden underneath the fabric of her shiakusho, immobilizing and acting as a sort of cast for her the limb. The Espada stared confused even as Rukia punctured the ground once with Sode no Shirayuki and called out, "Tsuji no Mai, Hakuren," following that she punctured the ground 4 more times, sinking into a battle stance and letting her Reisu surge as an icy gust of wind drove forward to flash freeze the Espada. The ice caught the Espada still wide-eyed in the sudden transition to Shikai, and Rukia knew it was only a temporary fix before the ice would crack and the battle would resume. Though some part of her desperately wished that the Espada would stay frozen forever, that the battle was over, even as she knew it was far from likely. Rukia held on to that the attack would at least incapacitate a few of the ever-creepy acid-like eyes. The thin layer of ice cracked after a moment and revealed a disgruntled Espada who studied Rukia with cold eyes and something like fury playing commonplace on his face. Many of the eyes adorning his body remained open, a thin layer of ice rendering it temporarily blind. "I have underestimated you, Shinigami, to my own arrogance," the Espada stated before turning to the Shinigami still in the corner. 5 of the eyes on Zomari's torso glowed, the same sickly lilac, as Rukia turned a half-pace, wincing as she saw the marks appear on her fellow Shinigami. The Espada charged at the same moment as the controlled Shinigami moved forward, blade snapping to and fro in a sluggish movement, one that Rukia reluctantly matched as she was unwilling to hurt a subordinate. It went against all she stood for. Dodging the overhead strike from the Espada, Rukia shoved the Shinigami back and turned to face the Espada, dodging a flurry of attacks, as she tried to keep her attention split between the Espada and her comrade. Rukia cried out in surprise and pain as the Shinigami's Zanpakuto sliced thinly into her side, blood trailing sluggishly from the wound, as her breath left her lips in a parted exhale of frost. She turned, sensing the Espada's movement, and blocked the blade, only to wince as an eye's pupil dilated bright purple, filling the arm as Rukia swung her left arm to block her right, surrounding her left arm's wool. Silently once more Rukia froze her arm, wincing at the numbing cold and the extra weight that dragged at 2 of her limbs, and chilled her body as she turned to the Espada and let a Byakurai slip from her fingers, piercing the hollow's shoulder even as she whipped around to defend against the controlled Shinigami. She could feel herself tiring, energy already drained from fighting the advanced hollows, the weight of her iced limbs, and restricting her motion so as to avoid injuring her fellow Shinigami. It was her downfall as Zamari darted in and Rukia raised her guard a moment too late, managing only to deflect the blade so that it pierced the outer edge of her abdomen. Cursing under her breath, Rukia frosted over the wound and retaliated using Kido, knowing it was a weakness of the espada after she had seen previous reactions to its uses. Wordlessly Rukia cast a Shakuho, followed by a Byakurai. Pushing the espada back and temporarily immobilizing him, she turned to the Shinigami who was charging forward. Blood breaking through the iced-over wound in her abdomen, she pulled her Reisu to her hands and called out, "Bakudo number 1 Sai." Instantly the Shinigami fell as the powerful binding locked his arms behind his back. Rukia barely had a second to turn and block, struggling against the larger espada's greater strength with only one arm and the ice crutch serving as half of her stance. The espada began a flurry of fast-moving blows and Rukia skidded back as one of the eyes dilated, quickly ushering her Reisu forth. She called out, "Some no mai, Tsukishiro." She drew a circle and watched as ice erupted in a pillar stretching towards the night sky like a beacon, the faint light of the nearby lamps distorted and shaky in its icy surface. She prayed that the espada was trapped in the ice, or that at the very least it had stopped Zamari and his overblown quest for sovereignty. Carefully adjusting her grip on Sode no Shirayuki, Rukia extended her senses, silently drawing on her remaining reserves of strength, and pushing aside the numb weight of her left arm and right leg. The telltale hum of sonido buzzed like cicadas in the still lingering quiet of Seoul society. Rukia pivoted and caught the espada's blade on her own. They initiated an intense flurry of attacks, cutting up, down to the side, slipping underneath in clumsy movements off balance because of her frozen limbs. She used her frozen arm as a shield whenever Zamari tried to use his Amor, the sovereignty technique, swinging her shoulder to move the arm that hung like lead at her side as they dueled. Her reserves were drawing thin. Rukia was cut in half a dozen places, the blood trailing sluggishly, and she knew the battle was drawing to a close. Her opponent was also near finished, scorches marring the pristine white of the espada's robes, blood leaking like wine in other areas, and yellow acrid eyes that burned with hatred. Staring at the hollow from across the street, Rukia knew this would be the final dramatic charge. In that moment her heart fluttered in her chest, and she thought of the upcoming war, the bloodshed, the pain, and for a moment she wanted to let it be, let it end. Then a pair of twins flashed through Rukia's eyes, Yuzu's soft smile and Karen's spunk. Hand tightening on Sode no Shirayuki, Rukia knew she wouldn't die, not here, not today. They charged, Rukia swaying near on her feet even as Sode no Shirayuki hummed in her hands and the last dredges of Reisu pulsed through her veins in cool rivers. They clashed once and Rukia felt the espada's blade clip her side, even as her Zanpakuto sliced cleanly through flesh and bone, blood draping the air in pearl-scent drops. Rukia collapsed to a knee, breath heavy in her lungs. She choked a laugh and murmured, "Arrogance," even as she vaguely registered a familiar arriving presence, the fading one of the espada, and let her conscience sink into blissful darkness with determination still gripping her heart and will. X. Chapter 52, Backpfeffengesucht. X. Ichigo shifted in the rickety plastic chair, resting unhappily on the plastic sheets, Kisuke's idea, serving as the floor of their tent. The young captain supposed it was a measure against the sand. Tough rice mats would likely have served just as well. Ichigo rather thought the plastic made sneaking out when Byakuya was sleeping difficult. It made the most horrible crinkling noise and he had received bleary-eyed glares a few times after slipping in from a night shift. Running a hand over his features and weaving fingers through his messy hair, Ichigo sighed and rolled his shoulders, taking a small respite before refocusing on the causality reports from the last advance. A frown settled firmly on his features as he added 2 more names to the list of letters to the families he would have to write a letter to, his hand and heart heavy and already mourning the thought of all the Shinigami lost in the war. For a few more minutes Ichigo continued to work in the empty silence of the tent, sorting papers, signing his signature with a flourish, letting his thoughts drift aimlessly, disturbed only by the rustle and chatter of passing Shinigami. Finally, when the dull monotony of completing paperwork overwhelmed his senses and rendered any further attempts useless, Ichigo pushed away from the small desk and stood to survey the tiny space with a critical eye. Byakuya had decided, upon first seeing their tent, that he had a love-hate relationship with the bone-like structure. Ichigo was still undecided with its low ceiling, white tarp walls, and the stacks upon stacks of paperwork. Most of it only needing cursory glances, or was there because of overflow. It wasn't like Ichigo and Byakuya inhabited the area other than for sleep, paperwork, and for the occasional moment of peace of mind, like most of the other captains. Usually, they were in war councils, speaking to the field soldiers, or visiting the med bay. Like Byakuya was doing at the moment, and probably would be for the next few hours. Renji, the lovable idiot, had decided to engage Grimmjow in battle in the recent attack to protect a few Shinigami who had been targeted by the adrenaline junkie of an Espada. The red-headed lieutenant had returned bloody, but alive, and Byakuya, ever the worrier about family, and redheads in particular, he had adopted the practice from Kyan, had departed for the med bay, likely to hold vigilance till the younger Shinigami awoke. Cracking his neck, Ichigo paused as his senses alerted him to the presence of Shinigami outside the tent. Though their Reisu was suppressed, so the number and identity was Ichigo's guess for the moment, partially because he was too lazy to try and discern the presences. Mumbling about meddling fates, and a penchant for trouble following him like a bloodhound, Ichigo pushed aside the tarpaulin sheets that served as their door and came face to face with two captains. He repressed the sigh building in his chest and regarded the two with a dry look. Resisting the urge to rest his palm against his forehead, Ichigo studied Shinji, left arm shimmering with barely visible iridescent kido sliding and molding around his arm, and a bruise blossoming on his cheek. There was a cocky grin dressing his features, but it was fragile and as clear as glass in its mockery. His eyes were dark where they glanced into Ichigo's own, pleading, asking, and apologizing all in one. Kensei behind the blonde had a distinctly unimpressed, and yet uncomfortable expression as he glanced around the camp with discerning eyes, Shinigami bustling by with hardly a glance at the trifecta of captains. Shaking his head and once more mumbling about idiotic captains as Ichigo's mind pieced together a likely plausible story for their appearance, the orange-haired captain stepped aside, propping the flap of his tent open so that the others could follow, ducking under the low entrance and stepping into the warm light of the oil lamp on the desk. "You two are idiots," Ichigo commented with a roll of his eyes as he settled onto one of the cots, staring the two down with an expectant expression as he waved the two captains over. Shinji settled on the ground beside the cot, letting Kensei take the seat with little to no plastic and far less squeaking, and squishing the blonde an inch closer to Ichigo. "Oi, at least let us defend ourselves before you call us names," Shinji demanded unrepentantly as he challenged Ichigo with a grin. The orange-haired captain studied the two and wondered why this was his life, even as he reluctantly nodded, motioning for the two to explain. "Okay, well, we decided that it would be a good idea to do some reconnaissance, see if we could get an idea of what was happening in the Hall of the Mighty Espada, because we know your mission was cut a bit short. So, we got into Hueco Mundo fine, mind you, didn't attract any attention till we got to the throne room." Shinji paused for a moment, discomfort flashing across his features as his gaze strayed to his arm, a flash of remembrance playing shadows over his eyes. Then the blonde straightened and continued, Kensei a solemn statue at his side. There was a meeting happening. And the self-proclaimed king was talking to his followers. A few were missing, preparing for another blow on Soul Society, and one was indisposed or whatever. Anyway, after some brief boring information, I'll include in the report, these Arrancar were brought in, 3 of them, looked decently human. They were charged with the betrayal of Los Noches for aiding a Shinigami that had fallen on the battlefield off the fields. Baragon unsheathed his sword and then he released his resurrection. It was all a show for sure, and he was crazy terrifying, a full skeleton regalia and all, and then he touched them with his sword and they just disintegrated? Crumbled to dust, the muscles, then bone stripped till there was nothing left. It was terrifying. And then he turned his attention to the rafters. I don't know how he detected us, maybe knew we were there the whole time, who can say? He sort of flew at us, and we were trying to escape without his blade touching us. His blade nicked me, and I could feel it eating at my skin, consuming my flesh, so I put a stasis kido to try and stop it, and here we are." Shinji finished with a helpless look and a grimace. Kensei looked a touch abashed at their mess of a night but mostly resigned. Ichigo stared at the two for a few minutes of silence, before he dragged a hand through his hair and stood up, swaying his way over to the desk where he grabbed a flask, one he had successfully kidnapped from Shinji, and took a swig before tossing it to Kensei, who followed the action before passing it once more to Shinji. "Let me see the arm," Ichigo commanded as he made his way over, willing the rant he felt bubbling up beneath Shiro's righteous fury and protectiveness to wait, and instead, he focused on saving Shinji's arm, after he could focus on chewing the idiots out. Shinji smiled a fragile tender smile, and stretched his left arm out, shimmering in the warm glow of the oil lamps. Ichigo crouched and inspected the cut. It was small, about the size of his pinky, and the flesh around it was already gone, muscle starting to peek out in some grim macabre scene, bone glistening white. Baragon's Reisu lingered and swelled about the wound, leaving Ichigo to contemplate the problem. Slowly he recalled the lessons Unohana had casually imparted as they walked through the markets of Rungokai, or when conversation wasn't necessarily an option. I think I'll be able to save your arm, but if not, we're going to tie it off below the elbow in case we need to save the rest of it. I'm going to try and override, or so to speak, to burn Baragon's Ryadesu and his powers to stop the process. If it works, you'll have to wrap the wound tightly to prevent infection and see Katetsu-san for immediate healing. Ichigo stated clinically and simply, putting aside his own feeling for the moment to focus on Shinji's wound. The blonde blanched at Ichigo's words, but it quickly morphed into grim determination, the kind that had always earned Ichigo's respect, and he nodded his acceptance. This may hurt. The young captain warned his friend as he ripped part of his shiakusho and wrapped a strip around the captain's elbow to stop the blood flow, and hopefully provide enough time for drastic measures if things went south. Then Ichigo took the flask from Kensei and tipped it back, letting the liquid courage burn his throat before he passed the flask to Shinji, who nodded, eyes dark and earnest, and mirrored the action. Swiftly Ichigo unsheathed Zanjutsu, the blade humming familiarly in his hands as Ichigo channeled his Reisu, letting the hollow portion of his heritage flow to the surface, through his body, pulling from his vast reserves and letting it spike through his blade, coalescing along the metal in arcs of ebony. The blonde captain extended his arm wordlessly, the air tight and serious as Kensei passed Shinji a gag, and the oil lamps flickered. Ichigo let Zanjutsu hover above the cut, taking a breath, centering himself and his will before he carefully let the blade cut through the stasis Kido and into the wound. He let Reisu flow through him like a conduit, bright pulsing energy, wild and chaotic. He focused on the feel of Baragon's Reisu, of chasing every wisp of it, infecting the wound and burning it to nothing. Ashes to ashes, as one would poetically claim when talking about time and certain grandiose hollows. Ichigo ignored Shinji, ignored Kensei, the outside world, focused utterly on the wound until he sat back with an exhale of exhaustion and looked up, Zanjutsu resting at his side. Part of the problem had been Baragon's strength. While nothing to compare to Bach, it was nothing to scoff at and still required minute force to eradicate. Then there were the wisps of it gathering and filling the wound, seeking to spread like maggots. Ichigo had to chase each filament down, piece by piece, because if even a lingering thread of it remained, if the flesh, bone, marrow, muscle held even a thought of decay and time, then it would spread. Sweat beaded Shinji's brow, his teeth were clenched around the gag, as he studied Ichigo with something like awe and thanks radiating from his amber eyes. Kensei seemed equally impressed and a hell of a lot less tense as he undid the binding that wrapped around Shinji's elbow with a tenderness most thought the silver-haired man didn't possess. Heaving himself to his feet, Ichigo repressed a shudder and lugged himself to the desk once more, carefully grabbing a roll of bandages before returning. Gently he inspected the wound, extended his senses to search for anything. With an exhale of relief he gently bandaged the wound, still raw with a hint of white. There would likely be a hell of a scar, and maybe slight muscle damage, but the idiot would survive. Ichigo leaned back and took a minute to pull at his Reisu, reassuring his energy and allowing the exhaustion that hovered like a fog to fall away slightly. The sleepless nights in a too familiar desert had only aided and abetted his insomnia and exhaustion. The tent was quiet as they all recovered, and Ichigo prepared his words to the gleeful, yet muted cheering of Shiro, and Asen's amusement. I retain my right to call the two of you complete idiots. Where in the three realms did you receive the bright idea to attempt an infiltration mission? You're not even good at reconnaissance, for Kami's sake. I understand you both are Vizard, but that doesn't mean an Espada can't sense you. And honestly, Shinji, your Zanpakuto, while an illusion type, is far from Sosuke's more material-based creations, and Kensei, your Zanpakuto, is all about hand-to-hand fighting. Why in the world did you consider this a good idea? Can you imagine what would have happened if they had captured or killed you? They would have used you as blackmail, maybe even for experiments, or if you had died, imagine the hole it would leave in Seoul society, how it would affect everyone and the morale of the troops. I hope you both understand the gravity of your actions, but I'm glad you survived. The young captain finished throwing himself to the floor once more, from where he had pulled to his feet to start pacing as he ranted. When he regarded the two older captains once more, they were appropriately mollified, both with shame clearly written on their features. Ichigo, satisfied that his lesson had been imparted, leaned back against the cot and took a swig from the flask. "So, what are you going to do with the information about the previously unknown resurrection of the leader of the Espada?" Ichigo asked amiably, releasing the tense air and allowing the two to focus on something other than their own foolish actions. The two captains shared a glance communicating without words, and Ichigo continued to sit there studying the two and prompting an answer. "We need to find a captain with a contrary Zanpakuto, or at least is capable of dealing with Baragon," Kensei seriously stated after a minute, staring at Ichigo with all the resolution of a brick wall, which was a lot apparently. Ichigo nodded and replied, "So who would that be?" "Well, the Suteiko for sure, maybe your little lieutenant." "Probably you, because Kami knows no one has ever seen your Bankai, you tricky bastard." "Is Hein if he would be willing?" Shinji replied after a beat, glaring at Ichigo when he suggested the orange-haired captain, still spiffed that no one had seen Ichigo's Bankai. Ichigo ignored the expression because he wasn't being guilted into releasing his Bankai, and that was a whole other cohort of problems he didn't want to face at the moment. Instead, he thought over the list of names and replied, "Toshiro is out, he's too young and inexperienced for Baragon. Is Hein wouldn't want to put his life in danger like that with his girls, plus he would be rusty. So that leaves me and the Suteiko. And while I think I could maybe deal with Baragon, I don't have an elemental Zanpakuto." "Yeah, but you do have your Iero, which can be damn near invincible." Shinji shot back, and Ichigo remained silent, contemplating the idea of fighting Baragon. While Ichigo was far from afraid of fighting the Skeletal King, he was more afraid of the power he would have to extend to win. Baragon's power, that of time and decay, was tricky and oh so very delicate. Ichigo was fine against any type of enemy, but time was an old friend in a bitter dream. To win he would have to employ techniques that would draw attention, more so than before, and with the Quincy War approaching, and a whole other plethora of problems, Ichigo preferred the image of a powerful, but mostly sane captain of the Godiai 13. Not a Shinigami, Quincy, hollow hybrid on the level of Kami. The Suteiko should handle it, Ichigo stated finally with a sigh followed by a swig of the sake. Shinji jerked as if he wanted to protest, proclaim Ichigo's undying strength, but then he caught Ichigo's eyes, the shades making home in warm brown eyes, and nodded, having known his friend for enough time to understand that particular sort of darkness. "Then we need the Suteiko here, and we should send one of ours back to Soul Society." Kensei commented insightfully and received nods from his companions. Ichigo reached over and held Zanjutsu's hilt, the blade almost purring as he waited in thought before announcing, "It would be best if we send Shunsui back to guide the Godiai 13 while the Suteiko is here." Ichigo received strange considering glances for the suggestion, but no objections were raised, and he continued, "We'll have a captain's meeting tomorrow. In the meantime, a certain blonde needs to go visit my second favorite healer." Shinji turned pale at the words but nodded with a resigned sigh. Ichigo had little doubt that Kensei would make sure the feline-like captain would actually make it to the med bay. The three sat in comfortable silence for a moment more, before Ichigo tossed Shinji the flask and guided them to the doorway, beckoning them out into the cold night with a warning eye and a warm smile. As he closed the tent flap and drifted to the desk with papers scuttled like sand upon a beach, Ichigo sighed and wondered when the war would end. He turned as Byakuya entered the tent with amusement and closed off Zoro and waved in greeting, idly contemplating a battle between the Suteiko and Baragon. The future was far more interesting than Ichigo ever thought could be created. Jushiro sipped calmly at the mug in his hands, inhaling the whispering spirals of steam and the deep scent of a chai blend, the warmth traveling through his chest and alleviating some of the centuries-old ache. Cradling the mug to his chest, Jushiro let his gaze drift to the sky, parallel to the ever-winding streets of Soul Society. It was gray and overcast, clouds hanging pregnant upon the air in great silver wisps with a lingering tension threading them together. The weather seemed to hearken a silence, dampening any noise, so that Soul Society appeared as if abandoned. Though perhaps, the captain considered in a certain sense it was. Many of the residents of the districts surrounding the Godiai 13 had been evacuated for safety precautions, leaving something akin to a ghost town. Silently the captain of the 13th was beyond glad that they had acted on the plan put forth by Ichigo and Byakuya during one of the many war councils that had filled time as if a pendulum at the mad rush to prepare battle plans, defenses, and every little detail in between, before the invading force would leave Soul Society. The plan had been shot down at first, many of the captains protesting on the basis of the sheer scale the evacuation would take, others on the matter of practicality. But in the end, Jushiro supposed it had been the correct movement, even with the relief camps, as he could still see the damage the recent attack had wrought. In the east, he could see wisps of smoke, broken shells of building, and rubble playing hopscotch over near every surface. The repairs after the war would likely be a matter not worth thinking about, Yukatake endeavored with a minute smile. Thinking of the attack gave Jushiro pause, the sounds of metal clashing against metal rising over his own heartbeat in the silence. Shaking the phantom sensation away, the wise captain sipped at the tea, absorbing a measure of calm from it. They had expected the attack in a sense. Word relayed through the grainy communications the 12th had finally solved that it was likely with the movement of the hollows. But they had been unable to predict a time, and the lack of knowledge had set everyone on edge, paranoia running rampant and curtailing the rooms like a horde of dark clouds. The invading force had been small, they suspected it was merely a test, to see how well defended their home was. 5 espada in total, though one had never revealed itself, remaining in the shadows. 3 had been engaged by captains, and 1 by a Shinigami of his own division. The Gentile captain's thoughts turned briefly to the Kukaki still under the tender care of the 4th Division, prayers of a desperate fever running through his mind as he thought of the frail-looking form, and suddenly he understood, if slightly, Shunsui's overbearing concern. Beyond all odds the young woman had been able to defeat one of the Espada. Jushiro had no knowledge of its current state, whether it was in the 12th morgue, or one of the prison cells developed by the Kido Corps and the 12th. But the Espada had been subdued by Rukia alone, without the aid of any other Shinigami. It sent a flutter of pride curling around his heart at the thought and elevated his decision further to promote the young Kukaki. Her experience in the mortal world had done her wonders, and likely by the end of the war, she would be more than ready for the position. It would help fill the gap left by Kaion's injury. While the Shiba head was still insistent on staying part of the Godi 13, even if that meant paperwork and division training, it didn't compete for the full mobility needed for a lieutenant. Though Retsu had shared with a secretive smile that Kisuke and Sosuke were working on a rough prosthetic, based on the ones the blonde scientist had seen on his semi-permanent sabbatical to the mortal realm. The idea brought a soft smile to Jushiro's lips, knowing how much it would impact the lieutenant, who much like his younger brother lived to protect. Rukia hadn't been the only casualty of the attack. Swyfon had been injured when she attempted to stop a hollow who, according to the young woman's report, been fast and precise with an apathetic nature. The lieutenant had only been injured in protecting Yoriyuki, with the almost fanatic obsession playing a large part. The wound had been shallow and the lieutenant would likely be freed within the next 24 hours. Rose and Love had encountered a pair of hollows that functioned as one espada. The duo's report had been as detailed as possible and had concluded that the duel had ended in a draw when the espada retreated, not of their own violation but obviously on the command of others. There was rumor that an espada had tried to attack the 4th but had seen one look of Retsu in all the aura of her past and promptly turned tail. Jushiro doubted the authenticity of the rumor but wasn't disabused to the notion of Anohana's rather violent other side. It was likely that if the rumors held truth, it had been the espada that had turned in the direction of the 12th, where he had met the dynamic duo of the science department. The battle was still mostly shrouded in rumor, though Jushiro knew it had ended with the hollow's escape, and Kisuke needing a few stitches to the blonde's utmost pleasure. Yukatake's side ached at the reminder of his own brief encounter with an Aaron Carr, and he thanked Kami above that Kaion had been around. He had suffered an attack earlier in the afternoon, and his body had still been weak, trying to recover the energy his body needed. It had been an Aaron Carr waiting, lusting to rise to power, and had decided to target the known weak link of the Godi 13. It sent spirals of shame, guilt, and a touch of distaste spiraling through Jushiro's thoughts on the matter of it all. He knew, logically speaking, that he wasn't the weak link. Shunsui had reiterated it countless times. But Jushiro was still only subject to doubt and misdemeaning thoughts. Shifting slightly, Jushiro pushed the thoughts of battle away and ignored the familiar ache filling his chest, burning intensely after his own fight, the wound tracing across his abdomen sewn with neat black stitches. The teapot was moved with a soft sound, loud like a cannon in the silence lingering, drawing the younger captain's attention as Jushiro glanced into the wise eyes of the man who was like a father to Shunsui and Jushiro. There was a deep sorrow and thought in those ancient ember-like eyes as the Suteiko turned away to gaze out over the lands under his protection. War was strange, Jushiro supposed, contemplating the way his own thoughts seemed impossibly loud, like thunder and lightning, in the silence without Shunsui to talk and flirt, and smile that dim flirtatious smile. He wasn't ashamed to admit that he missed the silly captain of the 8th. It wasn't only the souls of Rungokai that the Godei 13 was empty of, Jushiro conceded with a muted sigh, the Godei 13 feeling almost dull without the bright personalities invested in another dimension. It made the white-haired captain wish the war would draw to a close with haste, if only so that tea would not be so forlorn an event, and he could hear Ichigo complain, or Hirako yell across the halls at Hiri. Glancing back at his mentor, Jushiro noted the old man's distant gaze, and in an endeavor to not spend the whole time in contemplative silence, though he was not wholly unopposed to such an idea, he commented thoughtfully, "Dark thoughts." The Suteiko blinked and returned his attention to Jushiro, taking a sip of his tea. The old man conceded with a nod, eyes amused, and responded, "Dark times, dark thoughts. Is the state of the war so dire?" Jushiro asked honestly, seriousness coating his voice in even tones. The old man blinked as if remembering who he was speaking to, or that perhaps he was not alone, and his eyes softened minutely where they gazed at Jushiro, warmth filling them and transferring to his own soul. The white-haired captain smiled in kind, the fondness he felt for his old mentor filling his smile with honest warmth. The Suteiko conceded with a nod of his head and replied, "Not so grave as that. It is merely the future that troubles me. The Quincy are awakening, and I wonder if Seoul society will be ready." The words were strangely ominous, as if holding unknown weight, or having been spoken before, like a keen case of déjà vu. Jushiro thought over the words, acknowledging them with a nod and a furrow of his brow. They had known, those that had been alive at the time of the blood war, that it hadn't been the end. But he had held on to the fragile hope that the matter would lay sleeping. Though Jushiro knew that, as with everything in life, there would be trials, great momentous trials that were sometimes whispered to young children, and tales that were cautious platitudes. There was the curious sense that this was something like that, and he had a feeling of who the strings of fate danced around. Idly, with the sort of detachment that had become commonplace over his years living with the illness that had plagued him since childhood, Jushiro wondered if this war or the coming one would be the one that saw him draw his last breath. He knew the thought terrified Shunsui, but Jushiro had made peace with it all long ago. "Come, let us think no more of dark thoughts." The Suteiko spoke gruffly, rumbling baritone, pulling Jushiro from drifting thoughts. The white-haired captain nodded in agreement, toasting with his mug before he took a sip. He knew they would likely still speak of the war. There was little else to discuss as it buzzed around them, demanding to be talked about, but they would stray from thoughts of death. "Have you heard from Ichigo?" Jushiro asked the Suteiko amiably, smiling fondly at the thought of the redhead. He knew that the old man had spoken to Shunsui, as he was the main leader of the gathered captains, and didn't that place a knowing grin on his features, but Jushiro knew it was likely Ichigo had corresponded with the old man. The friendship between the Suteiko and Ichigo had been unexpected when they first caught the two chatting in the gardens of the first, drinking tea, and talking about systems of government. But as Jushiro had come to know the young man, he had come to see that the two were very similar for all that they were vastly different. Jushiro hardly felt jealous that the old man had another person to talk to, lacking far too few friends with his great age and position. The white-haired captain suspected that when Ichigo stepped down from his position as captain of the 10th, which he was planning, they all could tell, though few begrudged him for it, that the man would likely transfer to the 1st and become a lieutenant under Yamamoto. Only that the impulsive brat landed himself in the med bay again, but is otherwise fine. The Suteiko replied, sharing a chuckle with Jushiro over Ichigo's rather famous tenure when it came to the healers division. Briefly, he worried for the redhead before consoling himself with the knowledge that it was unlikely for anything to happen with the other, overprotective, captains around. A knock on the door disturbed the peace, and Kojiro stepped aside to let Kaien enter, crutches tucked under his arms, and a collage of maps crushed in the creases of his elbows. The Suteiko nodded in greeting, Jushiro mirroring the gesture, and the young Shiba head hobbled inside with a happy but subdued grin. Slowly he made his way over to the low table where he carefully set his crutches down before following suit. The visit, while a surprise, wasn't wholly unexpected, Jushiro supposed, knowing his lieutenant would stop for nothing when he had a mission, most certainly one of his own makings. "Good evening." Kaien greeted amiably as he unrolled the maps, letting first a map of Seoul society unroll beneath their eyes, a maze of white walls, and dirt-brown pathways, and then one of Hueco Mundo, sand, their trenches, and Los Noches. Pulling out a small silk bag, the lieutenant, with a grin fitting a child, which Kyan admittedly was, the young man began setting the piece over the two maps, black for Shinigami, and white for the Hollows. Okay, I think we're all ready now. Thought I might give a debrief so we're ready for the next captain's meeting. So, as you can see, the Hueco Mundo team has advanced 13 kilometers in the last week, that's the blue line. And from what Ichigo reluctantly relayed to me, they will be beginning an assault on the fortress within the next week. Kyan paused to shift the Seoul Society map on the top of the pile and continued, currently on Seoul Society's turf, the areas in red are buildings that have been damaged, and green is where the Espada appeared. The two captains studied the map carefully, looking for patterns in the attack. Kisuke had suggested something along the manner of fixed anchor points when they had discussed a direct invasion of the Godi I-13. Though Jushiro knew it would be unlikely for a full pattern to make itself known, having suffered only the singular attack. The Suteiko across from Jushiro hummed and nodded, keen eyes studying the map with the same intensity as Kyan. Kojiro bustled into the room, disturbing the contemplative silence. The older lieutenant settled beside the Suteiko with a careful incline of respect. Jushiro smiled warmly at the lieutenant before turning his attention to Kyan, who was studying the map with a light Jushiro had quickly come to recognize shining in sea green eyes. The next points of contact will likely target the captains encountered previously, as the Espada will have the greater amount of data, as opposed to you Suteiko. No Espada attacked the fourth, and there is no knowledge of your Zanpakuto or fighting style other than what is common knowledge. Kyan said after a few minutes, stating both the obvious and bringing attention to the manner that had slipped beneath their notice. Smiling softly at his lieutenant, Jushiro paused as a thought occurred to him, and he asked, "Do you think it is likely they will attack the division, or try to locate us separately?" The question hung in the air, with a perverse darkness spreading through their thoughts as they considered the devastation it could bring forth if the Espada attacked one of their divisions. Countless Shinigami lived in the barracks, to say the least of being caught in the battle, or in the likely rubble from such a battle. We simply don't have a way of knowing at the moment. However, it would likely be beneficial if we relocated some Shinigami to divisions that were not targeted. Kojiro suggested with a polite incline of his head, ever polite tenor filling the room. The suggestion received a positive hum of agreement, and Jushiro pushed aside the oncoming headache at the thought of the paperwork that would likely come from such a movement, instead focusing on the idea of the Shinigami under his protection safe. We know that Rose and Love will likely be targeted again. Though the two are always together, so they should be able to handle whatever Espada engages them. Sosuke reported that the Espada they faced was heavily damaged in their fight if it did show up again. Sosuke already reported that he knew how to deal with it, so the 12th shouldn't be concerned. Not that I would suggest evacuating it in the first place. Rukia dealt with the Espada, it is unlikely that they will send someone to attack her when she is in the 4th, so we should err on the side of caution in case they decide to send another opponent. Yuriuki says she might be able to handle the Espada but would likely require backup, with SWAFON in the 4th, and its power levels. Kyan stated, summarizing what they all already knew. Yukitake smiled blandly and responded with an amused glint, "And that leaves us. It would perhaps be wise to have young Hitsugaya-san paired with you two for safety measures." The Suteiko stated in suggestion, though it came out more like an order. For a minute Jushiro wanted to protest. He was well enough if he ignored the slight burn that filled his chest, and Kyan also looked as if he wished to protest, sharing the same will to fight. But with a soft nod towards his lieutenant, the Shiba head settled. Jushiro knew it was only the Suteiko's wish to protect his Shinigami, and that the experience working in a team if the Espada did attack would be a considerable gain for the young lieutenant. Nodding his consent to the idea, Jushiro sipped at his tea, once more observing the board as Kyan fiddled with the map, a keen light dancing in his eyes. Kojiro glanced up after a moment and softly suggested, "Perhaps we should lend the 8th Division Lieutenant to the 4th in case of another attack centered either on Anohana or Kukaki-san." The suggestion received consent, and after a moment Yamamoto summoned a few of the Jigo Kuko, the graceful creatures drifting through an open wind off the tails of the wind. The Suteiko carefully relayed the new movements in a rustling whisper, knowing that while a captain's meeting would be the best place to announce the temporary changes, the attack could come at any moment, and a warning of such would provide a sense of security. If Jushiro recalled correctly, there was a meeting in the early morning tomorrow. As the graceful carriers fluttered away with the messages, Jushiro let his attention drift, wondering if they would face the same errand car or if one of the Espada would be sent to deal with the captain and lieutenant of the 13th Division. It would be wise if we returned to the division now, Captain. We can start the evacuation measures. Kyan stated in aside, voice warm and compassionate as keen eyes glanced at the thin shafts of sunlight peeking through the seascape of clouds. Yukatake nodded and glanced at the Suteiko, who nodded, actions serving louder than words as Jushiro gracefully rose to his feet, Kyan following the motion albeit a touch slower. Together they glided towards the large doors guarding the entrance to the Suteiko's office. When they slammed open, a Shinigami dashing inside with breath heavy in the suddenly tense air and eyes wide. The young Shinigami blurted out, "Espada." The 12th is picking up traces of Garganta beginning to form, near the same locations as the time before. Kyan beside Jushiro cursed harshly, even as behind the two the Suteiko's eyes hardened like tempered steel, and Kojiro's hand strayed to the pommel of his Zanpakuto. Settling a hand on the frantic Shinigami's shoulder, Jushiro broadcasted calm as he gently said, "Thank you for alerting us, please return to your division." The Shinigami nodded and after a hesitant moment Flash stepped away. Glancing back at the Suteiko, Jushiro saw another Jigokuko perched on the Suteiko's finger, likely delivering the imminent warning of battle. Their eyes connected, and understanding passed between the two before Jushiro turned away. Gaining Kyan's attention, Jushiro nodded battle, drawing his features into grim determination, mirrored on the younger's features. Together the lieutenant and captain of the 13th Division made their ways through the winding streets of Seoul Society, towards their division, where Jushiro knew a battle was waiting. Silently he prayed for the health of his comrades and that the war would end soon. X. Chapter 53, Siri Miri. X. The 13th Division was quiet when Jushiro and Kyan arrived, the air hanging limp and tense as around them the sounds of Seoul Society waking for battle began to clatter upon the storm-swollen sky. Yukatake ignored the pain lingering faintly in his chest as they observed the division, the quiet murmur of sound drifting to meet them, and the flash of a Shiakusho. Slowly he let his attention stray to his lieutenant, catching the faint grimace on the young man's features as they entered the courtyard. The Shinigami of their division moved in frantic paces, near running at the report of the imminent attack, like ants scattered about the ground in a crazed search, or perhaps retreat. Yukatake paused, studying the rushing and near-frantic souls for a moment more before he flared his Reisu, the gentle presence commanding the attention of those within the courtyard as they stuttered to a stop. Jushiro smiled reassuringly at the Shinigami under his protection as they paused in their scurrying to face their captain. He noted the fear and panic splaying across their features with a touch of worry. The presence of hollows began to filter into the air like stale cigarette smoke, and knowing time was of great importance, gently but with hidden steel, the white-haired captain commanded, "We are evacuating the division because of the imminent attack and the likelihood of an attack here. Please relocate to either the 4th if you have healing experience or the 10th Division." It was a testament to his long tenure as the captain of the 13th, the camaraderie and familiarity he had built with those who surrounded him and his own calming nature, that the Shinigami only nodded, moving quickly and quietly, even as proximity alarms began to blare quietly throughout the streets of Seoul Society, warning of the incoming attack. Drawing a breath of courage, Yukatake pushed aside the weight that settled heavy on his chest, pressing at his lungs and heart like a great beast, dread and fear and an amalgamation of other emotions and prayers as the battle drew closer. Slowly he let his fingers drift to Sogyo no Kotori's handle, the twin spirits reflecting light energy that eased some of the growing tension and let his attention focus razor sharp, omitting thoughts of Hueco Mundo and Shunsui, centering only on the coming battle and preparations. "Is there anything I can aid you with, Captain?" Kyan asked softly, voice serious and lingering with the offer of aid. Yukatake turned warm green eyes upon his lieutenant, features determined where the young man leaned on his crutches, fingers straying over Nejibana's hilt, and the ever-present desire to serve Seoul Society, to protect in whatever manner possible, painting his features noble in the shadows of the afternoon. He studied Kyan for a moment more, eyes flickering to the Shinigami darting out of the division with the faint whispers of wind marking their passing, before deciding on a course of action with a nod. "Perhaps it would be best if you would fetch young Hichugaya-san and inform him of the influx of Shinigami, and if he hasn't received the Jigokuko, the idea of fighting together." Jushiro suggested softly, not a command, not if it wasn't absolutely needed. He tried to avoid that between their years of experience together and the trust between them. He knew that Kion would want to stay at Jushiro's side but would be swayed by his own morals. Indecision played across the young Shiba head's features for a moment before he nodded, sea eyes blazing with determination and will. The like which was a trait of the Shiba family Jushiro had seen many times over. The lieutenant, after trading a warm fond smile filled with promised inassurance, shared a nod of parting with Jushiro and disappeared in a burst of shunpo, significantly slower than when he had possessed both legs, but still well above the level of most third seats. Running his fingers through his hair, the white-haired captain turned away from the entrance to his division and instead focused his senses searching for the presence of a Garganta he knew would be materializing, one that was appearing in the training sails located in the back of the division. He sighed minutely and pulled his long white hair into a low tail, having dealt with the horrors of long hair in battle many times over, and with a prayer for courage, the older captain moved swiftly towards the Espada waiting there. The Garganta sprung into being with a loud startling crack as Jushiro arrived, the great tear in the fabric of their dimension eye-catching and foreboding as a shadowed figure appeared a silhouette against the yawning darkness. 3 other figures echoed behind the Espada that stepped through the Garganta, Reisu dancing upon the air thick and warning where it surrounded his senses as the invasion began in earnest. Subtly Yukatake summoned a Jigo Kuko and reported the presence of 3 Arrancar, cautioning that it would likely be best if Nano, Lisa, and Rainjika were to encounter the 3, based on what he could sense of their power levels, before they could wreak chaos on Soul Society. The delicate creature fluttered off towards the commander as the Espada stepped fully out of the portal and into the dim half-light of the training sail. The female Espada, for he assumed it was a she, had a cold calculating aura about her, piercing blue eyes observing the courtyard in all of its forms. A bone-white rather revealing uniform reminiscent of many detailed in the reports decorated her figure, and a blade glinted behind her back. There was a bone-biting power about the Espada that lingered on the air, bringing with it a chill, the sense of a predator prowling the waters for its next prey. The 3 Arrancar, likely the Espada's fraction, entered the courtyard behind the Espada who continued to survey the area. 3 women who studied Soul Society with varying expressions, interest, distaste, and apathy, but all radiating the sense of a predator released upon helpless prey. The female Espada's attention finally landed on Jushiro, who remained quiet standing in the half-shadows of the veranda, Reisu confined close to his chest and, expression blank but serious. He greeted the warrior's icy blue eyes with a nod of respect and acknowledgement and received one of his own, the air tremoring with the coming battle. The Espada whispered something to the 3 fraction, who scattered a moment later, leaving the 2 alone in the courtyard, the wind blowing, and the clouds watching overhead. The female Espada tilted her head curiously for a moment before stating in a voice that was sharp like a spear and as equally commanding, "I am Tyr Haribal the 2nd Espada, and you are?" The 2nd Espada's voice was muffled slightly by the fabric covering her mouth but did nothing to muffle the severity of her words and their meaning. The white-haired captain muffled a shocked expression and the stuttering of his heart at her place in the hierarchy, which he knew the Espada held. Of that hierarchy, she was below only one other Espada and the self-proclaimed king, which meant her power would be doubtless expansive. Yukatake nodded in acknowledgement, expression gentile and passive. He greeted in kind, Yukatake Jushiro, captain of the 13th Division. The 2 opponents studied each other for a moment more before Jushiro stepped off of the veranda and into the fading light of the courtyard, his steps impossibly loud in his ears, like drums beating a final march. Sogyo no Kotori slipped easily into his grasp as Haribal repeated the motion with her own blade, ever sharp eyes tracking his movements. They paused for a moment, the air tense and close to snapping before, with a breath that was like a shockwave, the 2nd Espada was attacking the captain of the 13th. Jushiro defended against the flurry of attacks that sailed from one movement to the next, blade sliding smoothly to block an overhead strike, before swinging vertically to block an attack from the side. He gritted his teeth at the force behind the blows and allowed his Reisu to flourish beneath his fingers as he sprung back a half step and let a wordless shakuho fly from his fingers, the Kido spell sparking harmlessly against the Espada's hollowed blade, and what reached the skin of her forearm was harmless against her arrow. Then she was upon him again, every move a calculated step in their game of chess, as Jushiro dodged a side sweep before he slid inside her defense and flicked his blade up with a clash of sparks as it met her own blade. They remained locked for a moment before they broke apart, and Haribal began a fast-paced combo of attacks, the movements quick and fluid like the rapids of a stream, fast and hard. To the left, overhead, whipping around to strike at his calves, reversing to the side and in, once more to the left before switching to the right. Jushiro met each blow, the force jarring his arms slightly as he continued to center himself in the battle, Sogyo no Kotori flowing easily from one attack to the next. They continued to clash for a few moments more, sparks flying as their blades melded the air seamlessly, testing the other's strength and skill, Kido occasionally bursting into the cloudy skies as it broke apart in a flurry of light. The two opponents flew apart once more, light panting filling the air as they studied each other, appraising their opponent and the skill they had displayed. Haribel was talented, a master with her blade, a key tactician, and worthy of the position she held within her own hierarchy. Jushiro knew that if he were to battle her alone for an extended period of time, even with his experience it would be a hard battle, his chances made worse especially considering his illness, which pulsed beneath the veins of his chest. If they weren't in a war against one another, Yukatake would be tempted to invite peace with the woman if only for her power and the lack of crazed bloodlust some Espada were rumored to hold. Her eyes, while fierce and chaotic, were not feral, they were intelligent, human in a strange sense, her skills and wisdom earning his respect. Jushiro repressed a shudder at such thoughts and the inevitability of life and death in war. Instead, he listened to Sogyo no Kotori's happy chatter as the fight continued. As the two fighters readied once more to move forward, two new presences made themselves known, flaring brightly in the dimming light, halting the two fighters' charge. Pivoting where he stood a cautious half-step, a warm smile broke across Jushiro's features as he caught sight of his lieutenant standing in the light of the courtyard, Nijibana at his side, crutches propping the Shiba head on 2 feet. Beside the young man was the lieutenant of the 10th Division, and soon to be a captain, Toshiro Hitsugaya. The youth was studying Haribel with keen cold eyes, Hyarin Maru unsheathed and glinting with promise at the prodigy's side. Haribel frowned at the appearance of the two other Shinigami. It was a tempered, calculating frown, one that belayed the Espada's concerns as Yukatake turned his attention to the second Espada once more, silently mourning unfair odds even as his own senses mocked fairness in war. With a lithe movement wrapped in tense-minute urgency, the Espada's blade was held in front of her facing the ground, Reisu gathering like an electrical storm. She called out, "Hunt Tiburon!" Water surged from the blade and surrounded the female Espada in a swirling cyclone of liquid as her Reisu rose to the air, flashing through the water in spikes of gold lightning before falling away to reveal Haribel's resurrection. Yukatake resisted the urge to cover Toshiro's eyes at the rather revealing outfit, and as the water finally dispersed fully, Jushiro felt slight amusement at the blush decorating his lieutenant's features. With a muted sigh, Jushiro shook the distracting thoughts away once more, letting his attention return carefully to the battle. Quietly he turned to face the Espada, feeling the way her Reisu lingered heavy in the air, like water rising around their feet every moment, a slow inescapable drowning. Haribel's blade had shifted from its small hollowed-out form, to a large pata, shaped almost like a shark tooth, and she held it with easy grace as she studied them coldly. She remained there for a moment, Reisu swirling and shifting, and as the Espada continued to eye her enemies, her blade began to shimmer. The three Shinigami stood still for a moment, watching the Espada with weary eyes as Reisu gathered before. With a wicked snap like the air itself had torn asunder, a glowing bolt of golden Reisu shot towards the three. Darting to the side, the white-haired captain spared a glance at the two lieutenants, assuring himself of their safety as they stood out of harm's way, Kyan leaning against the far wall, his crutches beside him, Zanpakuto held at the ready. Toshiro had slipped into a battle stance on the opposite side, Reisu drifting playfully around the young lieutenant. With a breath, Jushiro shifted so that he was in Haribel's focus and centered himself. He let his Reisu surge, Sogyo no Kotori's laughter rising like a chorus as Jushiro called out, "All waves, rise now and become my shield, lightning, strike now and become my blade." With a final burst of Reisu, the singular Zanpakuto split into the familiar forms of his Shikai. The blades comfortable in his hands as the rope stretched between the two, holding Sogyo no Kotori's charms as they caught hiding rays of sun and glimmered at the Espada, who watched the white-haired captain with keen eyes. Yukatake let his attention rest on the Espada even as peripherally he felt the two lieutenants gather their Reisu. The very air chilled, and the skies continued to darken, swelling with a great cold about them as Toshiro began to release his own Shikai. The young man's voice echoed in the clearing as he called out, "Sit upon the frozen heavens, Hyarin Maru." From the lieutenant's Zanpakuto, a familiar dragon of ice burst forth, scratching its way into the dark skies with a roar that vibrated throughout Seoul society and sent chills upon the air, and down the spines of all present. Silently Yuka mused that his division would definitely be seeing some remodeling after the conclusion of the battle with the release of such powerful elemental weapons. Kyan, a step behind Jushiro, released his Zanpakuto with a hum and a twirl of the blade, the usual dramatics muted in the face of a serious battle, Reisu gathering as the familiar trident-like shape of his lieutenant's Shikai came into being. Haribel across from the three Shinigami watched everything with a cautious eye before something close to a smile flitted across her feature, bearing far too many teeth to be anything but ferocious. Reisu gathered about her and the espada let her blade flick forward, a wave of water pouring from the tip and rushing like a tidal wave towards the three, all-consuming as if hurtled like a great beast towards them. Seeing the lieutenant's shock at the unexpected attack involving water, Jushiro slipped forward in front of the attack, letting Sogyo no Kotori's joyful laughter at the game echo throughout his Reisu as the water was caught in the left blade, channeled through his Zanpakuto as Reisu surged through his hands. The water charged from the right blade faster than one could visibly see. A wave of water, more akin to a tsunami was its size, as it towered above the division with a roaring scream announcing its crashing fall towards the second espada. The female espada remained standing in the face of the tidal wave of water roaring towards her, expression calm and calculating as with a graceful movement of her wrist the broad blade was directly in front of her and the water charging towards her contacted with a great hiss and was vaporized. Spouts of steam drifted listlessly through the air where it had contacted with her blade as the rest surged around her like Moses parting the Red Sea, as it collided with the far walls of the barrack. Attempting to mask his shock, Jushiro shifted in split-second instinct as he blocked the broad blade of the female espada where it crashed against his own, the larger form pushing heavily against the hasty X he had formed with his twin Zanpakuto. Her blade glowed once more with the gold Reisu that reminded Jushiro of the sun, and he shifted, pushing his opponent and himself away from the two lieutenants watching with careful eyes. Yuka ducked the bright burst of Ryutsu and fired a Byakurai in return, which Haribel carefully dodged. Kyan appeared to the left of the espada, Nijibana swirling as the espada turned and caught the trident-like blade against the broad surface of her own blade. They exchanged a flurry of movement, blades clashing with an echoless sort of clang as Kyan moved in half paces using Nijibana and his weight against his own opponent as temporary support even as water flowed around his foot and beaded his hair like a fine mist. Desperate to not leave his lieutenant battling alone when he only possessed one leg, Yuka shifted Sogyo no Kotori purposefully in his hands, catching the light and drawing Haribel's attention as she launched a roundhouse kick to Kyan's chest, sending the lieutenant to fly back crashing into the veranda. Jushiro repressed a worried shout as Haribel turned in from her blade, a massive jet of water once more shot towards him with blinding intensity. Thrusting his left blade forward, the white-haired captain hesitated only for a second as Toshiro called out, "Yuka-san, direct it towards me," before following the young man's command and absorbing the attack and redirecting it towards the younger lieutenant. Hiren Mara whipped up as the large wave of water raced towards him, and as it collided it shifted with a binding crackle of ice, another dragon joining its brother in the sky. It hovered for a moment, tail twining through the air before it swept towards the ground, roaring its defiance as it charged Haribel. The second espada's blade snapped up, eyes two narrowed points of cold iron, and before their eyes the ice dragon evaporated at the point of the blade, mist curtailing the air and thickening the atmosphere. The white-haired lieutenant didn't hesitate at the disappearance, or rather vaporization, of one of his ice dragons, charging forward. The two locked in combat, blades moving in a flurry as Toshiro slid under an overhead strike and thrust Hiren Mara through a gap in Haribel's guard, only to spring back as a broad swipe of her blade threatened to slice into his torso. A large jet of water shot forth from the espada's blade, racing towards the too close lieutenant, who whipped his blade up and a wall of ice materialized, the water crashing harmlessly against it with the sound of falling rain, dispersing to the side as Haribel charged forward. The telltale hum of Sonido sung upon the air as she appeared behind the white-haired lieutenant, who whipped around and deflected her overhead strike, Hiren Mara glinting against the bone-like blade. Behind Haribel, Kyan shifted out of the rubble, leaning against the remnants of a wall, blood trailing down his forehead where it mixed with the water beading his brow. He shared a glance with Jushiro, eyes glowing and fierce, who recognized it from the many times they had trained together. Kyan began to swirl Nijibana, generating great waves of water that surrounded his feet and ebbed and flowed with each elegant twirl of his trident as Toshiro continued to defend against Haribel, the two trading swift blows as ice and water crashed against each other, forming great spikes and leaving mist to curl openly upon the night air. With an imperceptible nod, Kyan sent the waves hurtling towards Jushiro, even as he continued to swirl his trident, water continually pooling and rising at his feet and soaking his Shiakusho. Elegantly the captain of the 13th absorbed the waves, and together they let two tidal waves surge towards the female Espada still locked in combat against the youngest lieutenant. The waves crashed upon the Espada from both sides, as Haribel remained locked against Toshiro, the water drenching her and battering against the Espada's vast strength. Opposite her, Toshiro's Reisu rose, ice cradling his features and twining upon his blade, and with something close to a grimace of a smile the young lieutenant called out, "Daigirin Hirin Meru." Even as graceful wings coalesced upon the lieutenant's back, beautiful and ethereal with the way they shifted in the mists, ice crept rapidly over the Espada where her blade connected with Toshiro's own and froze the water already coating her form, flash freezing her body as the temperature plummeted further with the release of the lieutenant's Bankai, the water ebbing around Kyan's feet, becoming sluggish at the freezing temperatures before thrashing like the roiling waves of the sea. Hesitantly Toshiro stepped back from the frozen Espada, blade still held at the ready as he studied Haribel, wondering if the ice would hold a being of her caliber, of her power. It was a wise move, as with a large crack that rent the air, the ice coating Haribel shattered like glass, and before one could draw breath 3 bright bursts of energy shot towards the white-haired lieutenant. Hirin Meru's wings wrapped around the youth as the attack clashed against the ice with a bright flash of light, shattering the wings but leaving the lieutenant relatively unharmed. As the wings began to rebuild themselves with creeping motions, Haribel charged forward, blade swinging like lightning upon the sky, like the predator charging for the kill at the scent of blood in the water. Kyan beside Yukatake swept the water surging around him, splaying across his feet and curling at his sides like a loving companion, and let it fly towards Haribel and in extension Toshiro with determination, forging his eyes into diamonds. The Espada let the water buffet her back, pushing her forward as Toshiro extended his Zanpakuto and froze the water in midair, redirecting it towards Haribel, who slashed with her sword, sending a jet of water that disrupted the icy daggers. Hirin Meru in the skies above roared, and trading a glance with Yukatake as Toshiro once more locked blades with the female Espada, Jushiro nodded and the dragon spiraled towards the earth. Extending Sogyo no Kotori's blade, Jushiro absorbed the dragon with a harsh pant as the drain on his Reisu at the large task registered and echoed in his lungs. Fluidly he shifted the attack through his Zanpakuto and let the dragon remerge larger than before, with sharp ice spiraling around its form in a fine mist as it flew towards Haribel. The female Espada, sensing the danger, let 3 rapid bursts of Reisu release from her blade, surprising Toshiro, who flew backwards to collide with the wall at the force of the attack, rubble crumbling and burying the white-haired youth. The female Espada pivoted as the dragon roared, charging her with the wrath and fury of its legendary ancestors. Haribel frowned at the beast, eyes flickering and swelling. She let it collide with her Zanpakuto, mists dancing upon the air, even as Jushiro was already a half step in front of her, Sogyo no Kotori flitting forward to clash against her large blade. They clashed, weapons flying, as Sogyo no Kotori shifted fluidly with Jushiro's movements. As he ducked a broad overhead sweep and let the right blade lash out at the woman's calf, a faint line of crimson appeared as he faintly pierced her arrow. In response to the cut, she growled something low, near inaudible, and slammed her blade overhead, water swirling about her feet, as Toshiro began to pick himself out of the remnants of the wall. Glancing at the Espada as she swung her large blade to the side, Jushiro twisted and shifted stance fluidly to the side, Sogyo no Kotori locked in an X formation to take the weight of the blow. The deep-sea blue was still ever calculating and calm, even as a wildness was seeping into her eyes, where they peered into his own from across their interlocked blades. Like the madness of a wounded animal backed into a cage, some part of Jushiro apologized for pushing the second Espada into such a position. Another part of him, the one that recalled this was his home, cried out in victory, and another part of him wanted the war to end with as little death as possible, however a flitting fancy. The two fighters pushed apart, distance stretched tight between them as Jushiro's breath came ragged in his lungs, and Haribel panted faintly across from him, ever composed as her blade swung forward and a jet of water once more burst forth. The air around it shrieked at its power. Before the water could collide with Sogyo no Kotori, it was whipped away, swirling behind Yukatake as Kyan appeared a half step behind the captain. Jushiro smiled slightly, The smile filled with pain as his lungs shuddered in warning and the taste of crimson tickled his throat, even as he blocked a vicious strike from Haribel that pushed Sogyo no Kotori close to his chest and strained his arms. Yukatake dropped suddenly to his knees as the blade flew harmlessly overhead, and from his lower position cast a shakuho that pushed the female espada back a few paces, giving Jushiro the room to rise slowly to his feet. He ignored the absent thoughts of age and Shunsui's nagging voice. With the low hum of Sonito, Jushiro caught the edge of her blade only to pause as Reisu gathered bright and golden around the edge of her blade and Sogyo no Kotori's left blade slid forward an inch to absorb the attack as he redirected it to the ground. The moment of distraction cost the white-haired captain as he instinctively slid back a few feet from where he had once stood, the blade cutting lightly into his chest but missing anything vital. A burning pain filled Jushiro's lungs as he panted. Sogyo no Kotori held at the ready, blood dripped down his chest and stained his shiakusho. The white-haired captain's eyes widened in surprise as he sunk to his knees, great racking coughs heaving his body regardless of the battle as the taste of copper filled his mouth, and Sogyo no Kotori fell limp in his grasp, the hushed concerns of the twins whispering in his mind as his body continued to tremble, and coughs painted his lips with blood. In the murky haze of pain, Jushiro pushed aside the torment of his body, drawing on fleeting wisps of Reisu that danced just out of reach as he glanced through bangs that had slipped free of the hair tie. Kyan was in front of Jushiro, a violent, frightful figure, like some wrathful god. Water swirled around the stump where his knee had been, forming a pseudo-leg as the lieutenant's trident clashed against Haribel's broad blade. Water rose around them, frothing and spitting in great towering walls that drenched everything so that it rose around Jushiro's knees, stained crimson with his blood, and phantom specters of shadow danced in the water. Tower and drown all Nijireta Haju no Megami. Kyan's voice announced in the midst of battle, clear amid the pattering of rain as his Reisu rose and drenched the air. Water poured from Nejibana's trident form and swirled around Kyan in thick swathes of green and blues that rippled as if fabric, and the water continued to rise, surging over Kyan's head and around the division walls, spilling over into Seoul society's streets. Yukatake covered his mouth to hold his breath as the water surged over him, but found as he coughed once more at the beckon of his lungs that the water simply flowed around his mouth, avoiding tiny bubbles of air. Covering his mouth once more at the feel of blood, Jushiro watched awed as thousands of lotus flowers filled the water, golds, amethysts, aquamarines, carmines dancing together in blinding awe. In front of him, the two continued to battle, flashes of light in the murky water that steadily became darker around them as if the night drew its cloak through the water. Kyan moved gracefully through the liquid as if he once more held both legs and all the skill of his many years as a Shinigami, Nijibana glowing like the ancient tridents of the Greek mythologies. Haribel battled valiantly against the lieutenant, the two clashing points as water swirled away any of Haribel's offensive attacks and attempted to fill her lungs, lotus petals clinging to her skin and seemingly pulsing in the darkness even as the water ripped itself away, at the same time confused and desperate. Jushiro shuddered as the pain pulsing throughout his lungs diminished slightly and he rose unsteadily to his feet. Water surged lovingly about his arms, and soft red petals tangled about his shiakusho as his hand sought the thin cut that crossed his chest, and Sogyo no Kotori marveled at their lieutenant's bankai. As the two continued to fight, Jushiro's eyes searched for the white-haired lieutenant and found him at the opposite end of the courtyard. Lotus flowers caught in his hair as Daigure and Hirin Maru glowed with ethereal light, and Toshiro stared with wide-eyed awe. Jushiro returned his attention carefully to his lieutenant, watching delicately as he noted the attacks and technique of Kyan's bankai. It was a bankai fit for a man with one leg. It gave him the advantage almost wholly over his opponent, discounting someone with water affinity such as Haribel. And though he wasn't certain of the lotus petals, Jushiro suspected they weren't mere decoration. He wondered how long the lieutenant had trained after losing his leg to achieve his bankai. As he studied his lieutenant, Jushiro noted Kyan's strength was waning, his movements beginning to slow. The white-haired captain suspected it was from maintaining his bankai in battle against an opponent. But he was not alone in his weariness. Haribel was also tiring, strength fading as the lotus petals decorating her body continued to glow. Their movements though were just as hard and fast as their blades remained locked before springing away and resuming deadly flashes of a blade like quicksilver. Suddenly, in a flurry of movements near to fast to comprehend, Haribel reversed her blade, as Kyan overextended his trident, and slashed a broad strike across the Shiba head's chest. The lieutenant took the attack with an expression of pain and pivoted, driving his Zanpakuto through the female espada's shoulder. With a soundless growl in the depths of the water, a siro burst from Haribel's fingers, brilliant yellow and shimmering in the water. It thrust Kayan back so that the lieutenant was floating near Yucatec, far from where the two had moved during the course of their battle. Toshiro stepped forward, taking the moment as his cue. Great pillars of ice slid through the water, blinding and fast, yet silent, so deadly silent. They surrounded Haribel. A double of the white-haired lieutenant distracted the female Espada for a split moment before the great beams of ice crashed into the female Espada and the dual image shattered. Slowly the water drained away as Kayan stood, clutching his chest, Nijibana swirling gracefully as it absorbed the water, lotus blossoms laying thousands upon thousands on the ground, a parade of soft colors plastered upon the earth. The four pillars stood in the echoes of the night, broad and taunting, as Jushiro turned careful eyes to the wound gracing his lieutenant's chest. Jushiro shifted carefully and gently to Kayan's side, wet clothing slowing his movements as he studied the pillars of ice where they encircled the female Espada, the air tense and silent as they wondered if the battle was finally finished. The ice pillars, giants in the night air, shuddered for a second before with an ear-splitting noise they cracked and began breaking apart with a continuous horrible screeching noise. Shatters of ice joined the multiple petals on the ground as they revealed Haribel in the epicon tray, ice spread like tragic glass around her, glinting off the ice crystals plating her features and the petals still scattered through her hair. There was a grin, something wild and excited though tame and hidden as it was on the female Espada's face. She swayed there for a moment, obviously barely holding on to conscious. She bowed in acknowledgement of the battle and with a great rippling crack fell backwards into a garganta, disappearing from sight before the three Shinigami could do anything. Jushiro found that he didn't much mind the second Espada's escape, as shocked laughter rippled from his lips regardless of the dull ache of his chest. She had been beyond a worthy opponent, cunning on her feet, a tactician at every turn, but she had held some semblance of kindness beneath the cold exterior. She had held the opportunity to end any of their lives at many turns, a press of her blade or a step too fast, but she had refrained. The captain of the 13th sighed as he surveyed his division, refraining with great effort from thinking of the necessary repairs, or remodeling, as he ran a hand through the wet strands of his hair, eyes carefully seeking out the two lieutenants. Toshiro was leaning against a pile of rubble that was once a wall, exhaustion decorating his features at the drain of adrenaline of battle, and the still lingering excitement of it all left a small grin on his features. Higher and Mera rested sealed at his side as the ice littering the ground began to melt, and a warm breeze rustled through the remnants of the barracks. Kayan was close to Jushiro, a step away, leaning against the still-released form of Nijibana, breathing heavily, head tilted back, and eyes closed, water glittering upon his features like beads of mist so that he looked for a second like the fey creatures of old. With a slow breath, the older lieutenant lowered himself to his feet, Nijibana shifting to the elegant form of a Zanpakuto in the Shiba head's hands. Kayan turned to Jushiro with a laugh on his lips and eyes bright beneath the exhaustion and said, "Guess we'll be doing a lot of repair work, Captain." Jushiro shook his head but nodded, a cough startling itself out of his chest, and he paused, waiting for a moment before settling slowly beside his lieutenant. He smiled reassuringly at Kayan even as he gently pressed Sogyo no Kotori into their sealed state. He felt drained, the kind of drain one feels deep within their bones, in their soul, but there was the relief and exuberance at living to see another day filling his lungs and lifting him slightly. Toshiro shuffled over after a minute. He stood beside the two surveying the remains of the division, the flower petals swirling on the warm breeze, the water stains seeping into the tiled stain, and he grinned apologetically but said nothing as he settled beside the three, a peaceful silence hovering among them as they simply were. After a moment, as Kayan shifted his Shiakusho to check on the gash bisecting his chest, Jushiro shifted and inspected the wound, a light healing Kido seeping from his fingers to heal the worst of the damage. As an afterthought, as he resisted the dizzying of the world, he summoned a Jigokuko requesting medical assistance at the 13th Division, and a report to the Suteiko that the Espada had escaped but with no casualties. Duty to his lieutenant's health and soul society finished, Jushiro took a deep breath of the air and rested his hands on his lap, half wishing for a cup of tea, and half wishing for Shunsui to be there talking a mile a minute and chortling about the young. X. Chapter 54, VAD. X. Ichigo stared at Los Noches where it towered before him, white walls almost crystalline in the hues of the moonlight, as the clash of battle roared behind the gathered captains sharp and horrid. Kenpei, Renji, and Kensei manned the first line of offense against the Hollows, the three serving as their generals as the forces of Soul Society encroached upon Los Noches territory in a bloody battle that rung with finality and lingered in the air like a fraying rope, or the light at the end of the tunnel. Grip tightening on Zanjitsu's hilt, Ichigo quietly glanced at the captains surrounding him, the final invading force. For a finale to the war between Los Noches and Soul Society, the captains sent to deal with the Espada and the self-proclaimed king of Hueco Mundo, while the division Shinigami battled the Hollows as a partial distraction. It sounded far grander than Ichigo felt it actually was. War lacked any true honor and majesty to be sung of, it was war. Byakuya was the epitome of serenity and grace beside Ichigo, hair pulled into an elegant tail, and Kenseikin gleaming in the moonlight. He looked all the part of the noble captain. As if sensing his gaze, the Kukaki heir turned his attention to Ichigo with a raised brow, eyes half alight in amusement and seriousness. The orange-haired captain simply smiled in reassurance, eyes fond where they gazed at the captain of the 6th. Said captain rolled his eyes in like fondness before returning to face the behemoth of an enemy before them. Shinji was on Ichigo's left, the picture of calm and relaxed as he slouched with an imitation of a grin dancing across his features. Underneath Ichigo could see fear and worry clouding ember eyes like a stormy night, sparks of lightning, vibrant gold, flashing throughout the storm, tempered and tamed by experience and will. Silently Ichigo hoped the captain would be alright if they were to face Baragon again, however unlikely the odds of such seemed. Shinji would be perfectly fine otherwise. There was little that could truly affect the nonchalant captain, and his arm was healed well enough, or at least Isane had reluctantly given the blonde the all-clear after one too many minutes spent with his pestering. Ahead of the three captains stood the Suteiko, presence flaring in the winds that whipped across the desert in a near sandstorm, Reisu pulsing bright and warm, a near tangible presence. The Suteiko had arrived the day before, stepping through a Soul Society made Garganta even as Shunsui reluctantly took leave of the base camp. The captain of the 8th had been unwilling to leave his soldiers, to leave the front lines and the battle. He had felt a sense of responsibility for the invading force. But the drunkard of a captain knew the old man was needed to deal with the hollow of Baragon's capabilities, and that Soul Society couldn't be left bereft of a leader if the hollows were to invade in a sense of perceived weakness. The past few days had been a flurry of orders filtered through Soul Society, passed between the two forces. Word of victory, and invasions, and the utmost urgency that the Suteiko departed to Hueco Mundo to deal with Baragon. Ichigo's heart had beat like a crescendo in his chest when he had read the missive detailing the victory, or at least an assumed victory, against Haribal. His lieutenant, Kion, and Yokotake had battled against the fierce Espada and held their own, even with Jushiro's condition and Kion's lack of both legs. That pride had been half consumed by worry the next moment when he read that Rose and Love were in the 4th, though with no critical injuries. Stark was an opponent not easily defeated and would be difficult for many of the captains, but Ichigo held no doubt they had fought well. Pulling his thoughts away from the troubles of Soul Society, Ichigo drew on a breath tinted with the taste of copper, and the presence of hollows, and allowed his concentration to center on the coming battles and the future. The two captains around Ichigo straightened imperceptibly as if sensing the tense air that settled around them like a mantle, like the breath before the executioner's blade fell. With an almost intangible signal, the Suteiko drew Ryujinjaka, the blade glinting in the light and sparking crimson. Wordless he stepped forward and with an elegant slash broke through the impassive walls of Los Noches, rendering the ancient stonework aside with a crash and the jarring sound of rubble crashing in the distance. From the now very visible, large hole in the wall, a draft of cool air wisped out, bringing it with it a violent chill as a shadow appeared in the entrance. Large and foreboding, the presence lingered in the shadows, watching but hardly waiting. Ichigo resisted the urge to groan and instead drew on Zanjitsu's strength, imbuing his body with energy. Yami stepped out of the shadows of the new doorway alone and imposing where he towered against Los Noches, a small blessing Ichigo supposed. The Espada studied the gathered captains with obvious distaste and disrespect, as if they were nothing more than insignificant ants gathering in the sand for which the Espada could crush. While Yami had always been powerful, his intelligence had never been something to boast of. Well, what do we have here? Seems like some scum decided to blow a hole in Los Noches. The hollow stated with a guffaw, beady eyes sharp and cruel where they studied the small group of captains. It was a look Ichigo vindictively wanted to erase, painfully from the arrogant Espada's face, but he resigned himself to drawing Zanjitsu quietly from the sheath, Byakuya miming the motion beside him. At the release of their Zanpakuto, glinting in the din of the battlefield still roaring behind them, Yami tipped his head back and laughed, great bellowing harsh laughter like ice grating against stone. The hollow subsided after a moment and taunted with a leer, Pathetic Shinigami, you think you can win. They remained silent and stoic in the face of Yami's boisterous and foul amusement. Eventually, the hollow calmed and stepped further out of the shadows of Los Noches, pushing the four back into the open sands as he seemed to swell, a living giant casting shadows on all before him. Ichigo wondered if Yami would attempt to defeat the four without the use of his resurrection, if he would simply fire zero after zero and continue to believe in his own power. Such a path would certainly lead to failure considering the captains he was facing, though anything but victory wasn't an option for the Shinigami. He almost wished for Ulquiorra to appear, to at least tell the oath of the opponents Yami was facing and their obvious skill level, but Ichigo took small mercies as Shiro's cackles resounded through his mind. Yami studied them all for a moment more, before with a bellow and the quick draw of his blade the hollow charged them. A great lumbering charge that reverberated through the sand and cast the image of a wild bull frothing at the mouth. The four captains split with the wind, Byakuya and Ichigo to the left, while the Suteiko and Shinji darted to the right. Unsure who to fight, the Espada bellowed once more and, following Ichigo's never-ending luck, turned and swung at Byakuya and Ichigo. Wordlessly the two slid into a low stance near shoulder to shoulder, Senbonzakura overlocking Zanjutsu to form an X shape as they shouldered the weight of the large blade together. They held off Yami for only a minute before the Espada of Rage was bellowing at Shinji, who had drawn a wicked slash down the spine of the Espada, who had left his back open to the enemy. The Suteiko watched from a short distance, knowing if they needed help he would step in, but preferring to let his captains handle the matter. Ichigo and Byakuya swiftly broke apart, and while the fool was distracted with Shinji, who was taunting the brute with bright eyes and a cocky smile, Ichigo channeled Reisu through his fingers and to his blade, letting it spark with the Reisu as he gathered it all and with a sharp slash sent a small Getsuga Tensho careening towards the large Espada. It crashed into Yami, burning out against his back and the injury there with a brilliant spark. The Espada roared in pain and anger and turned to face them once more, features twisted in fury and hatred. The Espada moved his blade in front of him, Reisu swelling and pulsing in thick drowning waves as his form seemed to shift and shimmer in the night sky, beady eyes alight with wicked pleasure as the hollow's Reisu continued to swell. Be enraged, Ira! Yami called out with a snarl and an explosion of Reisu that rocked the sand and sent gusts of wind billowing about the plain. Ichigo muffled a few expletives as the Espada began to grow, form twisting and swirling grotesquely in a violent storm of Ryutsu and sand. Silently Ichigo thanked the Espada that they were far away from the battlefield and far enough from Los Noches as the ninth Espada's form continued to grow and take shape into something monstrous. Ichigo could feel Byakuya and Shinji's tangible shock as the Espada finished transforming, the gigantic almost centipede-like body whirling around to face the three of them with a leer. Before they could register, the sudden Reisu was pressing like waves all around them, as the new creature in front of them, a bright burst of crimson shot towards the three, a hurtling star of death, broke them of their shock. The captain of the 10th stepped easily forward in front of his comrades, Zanjutsu snapping up as he dug his feet into the sand, a mildly pointless endeavor, considering the rather lacking grounding properties of sand. Ichigo let the vast burst of Reisu dissipate against Zanjutsu's blade with a hiss, Shiro's bloodlust humming against the blade, as he slid back a few feet at the force of the Zero. In the background, as the Zero finally dissipated, Ichigo felt Byakuya release his Shikai. The familiar Sakura petals danced upon the air around them and surged forward to surround Yami in a swirling deadly storm. Ichigo stepped out of the sand gathering around him with a huff and rejoined his comrades. Silently he let his Reisu surge once more towards his blade. With an exhale he released two quick-fire Getsuga Tensho that slammed into Yami with all the force of a hurricane, caught unaware as he was distracted by the thousands of tiny blades in the process of slicing through his Iero. With a ripple of Reisu and a faint dizzying sensation that spread and disappeared as quickly as the wind, Shinji stepped forward, Sakanda spinning fluidly at his side. Byakuya appeared beside Ichigo as they watched confusion warp Yami's features as he swung towards them, or what the hollow likely saw as the three standing in front of him, but only ended up charging in the opposite direction, looking some mind-warped being swinging at nothing. Yami continued to strike at the sand, the small grains surging into the air in great curtains entangling with the Sakura blades still hanging upon the air. Ichigo watched tensely, wondering how long the illusion would hold as Shinji continued to taunt the hollow, earning a rapid flurry of strikes burying deeper and deeper in the sands as Reisu roiled like a storm-swept sea. With an angry roar, one that was purely animalistic, the hollow charged a Zero, the air going acrid as Reisu gathered around the large espada. With a great bellow, the large monstrous espada turned in a full circle, crimson Reisu burning the sand in a fiery beam that was pure catastrophe and anger surging out around the hollow and destroying all in its path for miles. The three captains carefully dodged out of the way of the scorching Reisu even as Ichigo shot forward low to the ground, ducking carefully under the sizzling ray of doom. It caught at the tail end of his Shiakusho, burning through at some places only to encounter his own arrow as Ichigo slid easily through the sand. When he was in a close enough proximity to Yami, he let Reisu sharpen Zanjutsu's blade to the fine point of a diamond as he whipped into the air with a burst of shunpo. The beast of an espada turned his head to look where Ichigo would have been standing in the inverted world he was trapped in, eyes glaring and gleeful at the opportunity to crush him as the espada bellowed insult after vile insult. Ichigo wondered if the espada had even realized he was trapped in an illusion as the rage-filled hollow slashed forward, his many legs moving in grim tangent. Pulling his Reisu forward like a cloak around himself, Ichigo chose the area he would attack and charged towards the hollow, falling through the air, wind pulling at his features even as sakura petals danced around Yami's head, temporarily blinding the creature and distracting it. With a burst of Ryutsu, Ichigo cut through two of Yami's legs with a sound that was bone and flesh and everything else falling apart but not. The two great legs fell with heavy thumps, the sound echoing upon the desert as if beckoning greater silence. Yami wobbled precariously, leaning drastically to one side even as the hollow roared and cursed. Clumsy and yet deadly, the espada continued to launch bala in all directions, his rage permeating the air like spores. Shinji stepped forward in front of the great beast, even as Ichigo moved to the other side of Yami, swinging Sakanda gracefully and casually with an ever-present Cheshire grin. The blonde taunted the rampant espada. Mildly Ichigo wondered if, through the power of rage alone, the less-than-bright espada would break through the net of Sakanda's inverted world. With a roar, Yami charged Shinji, actually charged in the right direction, though Ichigo doubted he could see it all and was merely following the inherent instinct that drove all hollows once more. He had reverted only to basic instinct, nothing of human-like intelligence or cognizant thought remaining, though there had always been little of such. Sakura petals blossomed around the creature even as Ichigo charged an overpowered Getsuga Tensho, and with a breath that tugged on his composure and Zanjutsu, Ichigo released the energy swelling under his skin. The two forces crashed into the espada with a wave of sand blurring their opponent temporarily from sight, as they waited tense and silent. Knowing that the attack wouldn't be enough to take down the crazed espada, Ichigo shared a quick look with Byakuya and Shinji, making a short motion with his hand that received quick nods of acknowledgement. With a mighty roar, that pierced and chilled all those who listened, and a tremble of the earth, the dust cleared and Yami appeared, larger than before, the many legs gone, and in its place a wide plain served as the espada's chest, horns peeking from Yami's head and the lack of wounds appeared stark against the sky. Reisu crowed and screamed with the espada even as chopped laughter began to filter the air, chilling a deafening. Ichigo studied the espada with cold hard eyes, as the ninth espada's attention swung towards the three, and with great lumbering strides, the espada thundered forward, the land shaking with his movements. The three captains quickly darted out of the way, shunpo fast and light over the sand, long familiar with its tread after consecutive days on the field. Silently Byakuya darted forward, Senbonzakura following his motions in sweeping waves, as Shinji wrapped around the other side of the espada. Concentrating, Ichigo took a breath and focused on his Ryutsu, on picturing the Kido he would cast within his mind. Peripherally his attention remained on the battle and the distraction the two weaved around the espada even as his focus dwelled deeper and deeper as the Bakudo began to take shape, glowing and surrounding him in rich Reisu. Instincts screaming in warning, Ichigo glanced up a second too late as a large tail swung towards him, blindingly slow in a drawn-out moment as Ichigo's movements felt as if dragged by molasses tugging at every appendage. He ducked the large extremity, the wind billowing and ruffling over and around him like the gales of a tornado with the passing overhead of the tail. Ichigo rose to his feet, Reisu still surrounding him, only to stop stone still as Byakuya's cry rang through the air and Ichigo took the split second he had to pull his arrow and blood vein around him. The large arm impacted Ichigo with all the force of a charging horde of hollows, slamming into his chest and drawing his breath out of him even as the pain and injury from such an attack were rendered near non-existent. The captain of the 10th tumbled and rolled over into the sand, flying backwards as the grains surged around him. Desperately Ichigo dug Zanjutsu into the sand, halting the slide of his body slowly as the force of the attack dispersed. Pulling himself out of the sand with a drawing heaving inhale of stale desert air, Ichigo shook out the sand clinging to him like younger sibling, covering his Shiakusho and beat it into his hair. Idly he pulled aside the sleeve of his Shiakusho to see a large bruise, reds and purples forming a lovely mosaic, already beginning to form, light and shallow as it was. The clash of blades and a roar drew Ichigo's attention once more to the battle. Ichigo glanced at the espada with a near growl where Yami was once more occupied with Byakuya, whose Reisu was raging upon the espada sharp and cold fury. Cloaking his presence with a tug of Reisu, Ichigo moved forward gathering the Bakudo once more. He let Reisu flow to his hands. Pulling on his vast reserves, he studied the espada and ignored the harsh panting as he tried to retain air in his lungs, instead focusing on the incantation and the desired results, allowing his Reisu to shape it with his will. The Bakudo finally charged to its maximum capacity, which with Ichigo was hardly an insignificant amount. The captain of the 10th flared his Reisu, bright and calling, taunting, and filled with vindictive joy. Yami pivoted roughly, tail sweeping out and nearly missing Shinji. Ichigo stared the hollow-down eyes glowing and called out, "Wall of iron, tower formed from hate, forge molten iron and neatly finish in silence." Bakudo number 75 Gakuteken. With a burst of Reisu, 5 pillars slammed into Yami, nailing him to the ground and preventing movement as the hollow thrashed and struggled against the great weight bearing against him. Ichigo panted as he maintained the Kido, continuing to feed Reisu into the pillars as Byakuya moved forward swift and deadly, features graceful in their lethality as Senbonzakura moved with a swift motion and ended the battle. With a soft exhale, Ichigo released the Kido, the large pillars disappearing in bright fluttering feathers of Reisu as the body slammed into the sands with a shockwave that rippled through their feet and sent sand flying in a great palisade of light. A moment later, after the dust had literally settled, the Suteiko stepped forward studying the 3 captains with warmth, dark coals glowing with pride. Ichigo coughed and mustered a weak smile even as he filtered Reisu into a minute healing Kido and moved his way to Byakuya, who was studying Ichigo with a delicate mix of worry, and the urge to bash one's partner over the head for worrying them. Ichigo just waved weakly, and Shinji guffawed, the sound loud and free, as he sheathed Sakanda, the blade's pleasure at seeing battle humming faintly on the air around them in a low vibrating sound, almost like a feline purr. The Suteiko studied the body for a moment, lying on the sands like the end of an American monster movie, larger than life and just as inertly terrifying. Elegantly the old man unsheathed Ryujinjaka and with a wide sweep started a fire, crimson flames flickering and devouring over the remains, disposing of the body and crystallizing the glass around them from the sheer intensity of the heat. As the body of the 9th Espada was rendered to dust, the invading force of captains paused for a moment to catch their breath, sharing quick reassuring glances ascertaining one another of life as Shinji tossed Ichigo a canteen, full of water rather than sake, and drawled, "Well, that was one way to start an invasion." Ichigo chuckled and shook his head at the blonde's casual summarization and tossed the canteen to Byakuya, who caught it with a faintly amused smile. They stood in silence for a moment more, replenishing their reserves of Reisu and taking the moment to recover from the battle before they collectively moved swiftly across the sands, towards the large hole, and still standing Los Noches, cool air taunting and warning of the coming battles. Briefly, Ichigo glanced over his shoulder, aware of the war raging on 2 fields, the sea of ebony, ivory, and among it all crimson like a beacon of death. The Shinigami were fighting with a great fervor, blood staining the stands even as they forced back the hollows, ever closer to the walls and shelter of Los Noches. The fall of one of their most powerful leaders had likely disheartened the creatures of instinct and provided a change in the ceaseless tug of war that had been the flow of battle. Neliel could likely do little to stop the swift flow of war overcoming the forces of Hueco Mundo. Byakuya rested a hand briefly on Ichigo's shoulder, pulling his attention from the battle behind them and grounding him in the war in front of them. His eyes were warm and fond once more, asking if he was truly okay, even knowing Ichigo's stellar reputation for surviving the most particular wounds. Ichigo nodded imperceptibly and tilted his head with a smile before his eyes strayed to Shinji and the Suteiko striding ahead of them and passing through the hole in the wall, striking figures as they were swallowed by the darkness of the entryway. Nodding once more at each other, the 2 younger captains followed their superiors into the darkness. Los Noches was always the same, though in this timeline it lacked the overbearing blue sky. One could never destroy the lingering sense of something else, something ancient, and the strange hues of shadow refracted through the white walls. Ichigo slid to the front of the group with ease, having mapped the place for the reconnaissance mission, and his own intimate familiarity with the building. One came to know a place very well when they destroyed or fought in half of it. The others made no signs of protest as Ichigo's eyes observed their location and the best path to the throne room. The air was tense and oppressive, hanging over them like an imminent summons as they glided like wraiths through the halls, senses open and spread out as they searched for any nearby presences. Shinji sidled behind Ichigo with a faint eerie whistle that both amused Ichigo and made him roll his eyes as he glanced back at the blonde with a raised eye, knowing the blonde likely wanted something. "Who do ya suspect we'll meet on our little rendezvous?" Shinji asked, quiet as if the silence prompted a lack of speaking but still holding the blonde's ever-present amusement. Ichigo shook his head slightly and shrugged mutinously but thought honestly about the question before replying with another half-shrug. It was easier to say who they wouldn't encounter, primarily the deceased Espadas such as Zamari, Neutra, and now Yami, as opposed to those still alive and kicking within the palace. Though Ichigo supposed it was likely Haribel was still too injured to fight, so she would likely remain out of sight. The captain of the fifth was unperturbed by Ichigo's silence. Crinkling his brow for a moment, he casually responded, "I doubt it would be the second Espada, your little lieutenant, dear older brother," and Yukatake apparently did a number. "I wonder if the bastard who put Love and Rose in the fourth will appear." Love, and I quote, said, "Man, he was just too lazy to finish us off. I wonder if he'll be too lazy to fight." Ichigo valiantly resisted the urge to laugh, or maybe giggle in a not at all crazed manner, hearing the other wizard talk about Starkey and the Espada's reluctance to complete any action. He was more than thankful Starkey had respected his wishes and refrained from killing Love and Rose, though Ichigo knew some of Shinji's complaint likely held a fraction of truth. The act of refraining from killing the Shinigami helped to forge the already burgeoning idea that the Espada, at least some of them, weren't mindless killing beasts, and were following Baragon through necessity alone. Squinting briefly at the intersection before them, corridors branching off in an endless maze of white, Ichigo mentally ran the area through his mind, and let his senses drift, searching for any Espada he would prefer to avoid lingering in waiting. The labs were one place he would stay very clear of. Though it seemed the only Espada within the boundless walls were Starkey, Ulquiorra, Haribel, Grimmjow, and perhaps Neliel, he could sense her nearby, but as usual, her presence seemed to drift everywhere, an endless game of tag. That was of course excluding Baragon, who was a category all his own. Decision made, Ichigo led them forward through one of the narrow winding corridors that seemed to threaten to close off around you, and Shinji, after a minute of the lingering silence that tangled at one's heels with ghost whispers, piped up, "I mean, imagine fighting one of the crazed bastards, just like Kenpeki." Ichigo rolled his eyes and murmured about knocking on wood, which always earned him a strange glance, and challenging fate, right as a door set in the wall to the left slid open with a hiss of shadows, and wild feral riots spilt out into the hallway. The other captains tensed even as Ichigo glanced over his shoulders and pointedly stared his friend down. Shinji only shrugged haplessly, as one must do in the given situation. Grimmjow appeared from the shadows with a cocky grin, one that never slipped or even cracked minutely at the sight of the four captains. The cocky bastard. The blue-haired Espada leaned against the frame of the doorway, all sinew and casual predator, a nasty scar still healing down the side of his temple and the hilt of his blade peeking from the sash of his obi. Grimmjow's eyes roved over the four with a vibrant light, as if assessing who would provide the most entertainment to the ever-bloodthirsty Espada. The cat-like Hollow's eyes passed over Ichigo with a barely there wink, and the blatantly obvious desire to fight Ichigo, who only shook his head imperceptibly, before passing over the others with mild interest. Before the fifth Espada could challenge one of them, Shinji stepped forward with a bloodthirsty smile, Sakonda shining through in the wicked glimpse of a Cheshire grin, eyes near ochre with the wizard's hollow side. Grimmjow grinned wide and manic at the blonde, who only smiled in return, the tension between the two swelling and building like a storm, radiating out through the hallways. "Don't worry, I've got this, you three go on ahead," Shinji called out over his shoulder, confident and sure as he continued to stare the fifth Espada down. Grimmjow studied the blonde for a tense second as if weighing his merit and power, before a wide predatory grin settled across his features, lighting his eyes up like a madman. The blonde glanced once over his shoulder and nodded, eyes connecting with Ichigo. They conveyed a sense of promise, depth serious and burning with determination, before they disappeared in a blur of Shunpo and Sonito. The lack of their vibrant presences rang like a stark wound, a reminder of empty space once valued. Carefully Ichigo let his senses track the two, following them as they exited the main part of Los Noches and appeared in what was considered one of the training areas, which were really areas without proper floors and tall walls, with a few layers for support. Nodding to himself, Ichigo whispered a prayer for the both of them, even knowing that they would be fine. Grimmjow had a willpower near enough to match Ichigo's, and Shinji wouldn't fall easily. The more pressing concern was how much blood they would lose in beating each other into bloody pulps, though at least the two adrenaline junkies would have fun, and that was what the fourth was for. "Do you think Hirako will be okay?" Byakuya asked quietly, glancing at the repeating walls that dripped on and on like an intravenous, slowly filtering into your mind and dulling the senses. Ichigo nodded with a muffled scoff and responded, "He'll be fine, bloody, but fine. Though we probably will want to avoid Kisuke, and Sosuke afterwards. Kami knows how the poor scientist Espada in their hands is faring." The captain of the sixth conceded with a nod and an amused shake of his head. The Suteiko behind the two remained quiet and serene, assured of their battle and the survival of the Godi I-13's captains. Ichigo continued to lead them forward, disrupting the silence of the walls, drawing ever closer to the throne room. The captain of the 10th faltered minutely in his sure path as he sensed Haribel, a minute present drifting like a fine mist, or the aftertaste of rain and lacking one of her fraction. A part of Ichigo wanted to desert Byakuya and the Suteiko, knowing they were beyond capable of taking care of themselves. The piece of Ichigo intertwined with the core of who he was, the part that thrived on protecting others wanted to check on Haribel's state. Instead, he forced his attention forward, knowing the Espada would be fine. She was forged of a finer steel than any number of Shinigami and Quincy Ichigo had met in the long years of his life. Asen rumbled contentedly in agreement of his decision, even as Shiro's energy thrummed beneath Ichigo's fingers, echoing the desire to feel the adrenaline of battle that always lingered in war. Ulquiorra's appearance was far less flashy than Grimmjow but still adhered to the quiet Espada's secret sense of drama. The apathetic Espada drifted from the shadows from one second to the next, the beat of a heart, tendrils of darkness lingering and tugging at him, and forming great wings of darkness. The third Espada studied them with blank all-seeing eyes, staring into Ichigo's own for a moment with clear understanding before drifting to observe Byakuya and the Suteiko like one observed the world turning. That tightly wound Reisu, loose like a rope waiting to be used, drifted through the room, and Byakuya wordlessly stepped forward, Kensei-ken glinting as his Reisu, the breath of spring a storm mighty and powerful, swept out to meet Ulquiorra. Byakuya pivoted a half-step, gaze locked with Ichigo, promise heavy and leaden in his eyes before they shared a nod, understanding passing easily between the two. Then Ulquiorra and the captain of the sixth were gone with only a soft sigh to mark their venture. Ever the dramatics, the two were likely fighting above Los Noches, where they could all be seen, and hopefully avoid causing greater increments of damage to the vast palace. Ichigo could only find amusement at their antics as he glanced at the Suteiko who glided forward to stand beside Ichigo, eyes honest and sturdy where they gazed into Ichigo's own. The orange-haired captain nodded once, murmured about one-on-one battles and inevitability before leading them forward, the throne room taunting and bright like a blitz on their senses. Their walk was quiet, and Ichigo mentally prepared himself, for the fight against Stark, but also for the dull realization that at the end of the long night in Hueco Mundo the war, so-called the Balance War, would come to a close. An infinite finish, and yet never ending in the minute circles of Shinigami and Hollow. It was an almost strange sense to imagine a war drawing to an end without extended loss of life or damage. And the prospect of an unsteady peace between the two forces was like a beacon of promise, assuring Ichigo that he was succeeding however slightly. For the third time as they walked silently through the halls of Los Noches, an Espada appeared, pulling the two captains to quick attention. Stark was alone where he stood in front of two ornate doors, that towered above their heads with carvings like Renaissance marble embossing the large frame. The first Espada studied the two of them with a lazy half-smile, hand resting idly on his katana, even as Ichigo could sense Lilynet lingering nearby, likely on Stark's orders. "You see, I'm supposed to stop the both of you from entering, but I don't really think that's possible." Stark rumbled, that deep voice rough with disuse stated nonchalantly with an obvious glance at the Suteiko who remained impassive at the sight of the Espada before them. The first Espada's Reisu drifted throughout the small antechamber, wild and feral, sharp and biting, with an undercurrent of loneliness, the lone wolf, or coyote Ichigo supposed as he pivoted a half-step to glance into the Suteiko's eyes. The captain of the 10th nodded once, an acknowledgement and promise all wrapped up swiftly into the movement. The Suteiko nodded slowly in response and Ichigo stepped closer for a sparse moment. Eyes warm and fond, he whispered, "Be careful of Baragon, he is cunning and guileless in his old age." Yamamoto nodded, eyes flickering to life with an old flame, powerful in its ancient mannerisms, leaving Ichigo to grin at the hint of a smile escaping the confines of the old man's beard. The three paused suddenly as a large sound ripped throughout the air, accompanied by a violent burst of Reisu that scattered across their senses like an echo through a cannon. Ichigo sighed and muttered about prideful cats and posturing before he turned to Stark with an easy, inviting grin. The Espada grinned once, sharp and feral, then he nodded and stepped aside from the magnificent doors, leaving an open pathway to Baragon for the Suteiko. "Take care, old man," Stark called over his shoulders. As he turned away with a swirl of his white cloak, Ichigo rolled his eyes at the Hollow's lack of tact and blatant dislike of Baragon. Even as with a nod he vanished and Ichigo followed. The two opponents disappeared in sharp bursts of Sonido and Shunpo, leaving the Suteiko alone to face Baragon. They appeared in one of the many training areas, sand soft beneath the soles of Ichigo's sandals, and the skies of Hueco Mundo bearing witness to the coming battle. Lilinette, lounging on a few pillows tucked in the shade of the entrance, waved to Ichigo once, before returning her attention to whatever was in her hands. From the distance it looked like an assortment of bones. With a huff of amusement, Ichigo returned his attention to Stark and tamped down on Shiro's gleeful bloodlust at the prospect of a fight, knowing that the Hollow would be happy enough with the battle, even as Ichigo mentally readjusted the seal over his Ryutsu. If he was to battle Stark away from the prying eyes of the rest of the world, then he would fight the Espada properly. Stark deserved all the measure of Ichigo's considerable skill. All his Reisu was a bit too much. "It's been a while, Ichigo," the Espada commented lightly, drawing his katana with a short simple motion. Ichigo nodded with an exasperated expression and replied, "Yes, like we weren't fighting on the sands of Hueco Mundo a week and a half ago." That wasn't what the Coyote Espada meant, and they both knew it. Fighting on the battlefield was like a stage duel, every move carefully choreographed. Ichigo's wry statement earned a chuckle, though with Stark the sound was more akin to harsh barking laughter. The peaceful aura between the two slowly drained, as they studied one another, their stances, their blades, their will glowing in the half-light of Hueco Mundo, to be filled with a tenseness seeped not in life or death but the challenge. There was nothing, figuratively, riding on the outcome of their battle. They had both dueled each other before, and no matter who won, Soul Society would likely hold the greater victory over Los Noches, and Ichigo would walk out of Los Noches. Stark, however, was the one whose future lingered on the decision of the Suteiko regarding the Espada. With a hiss of metal against sheath, Ichigo drew Zanjutsu, the weight of the blade familiar in his hands where it glinted as if shining from within. Reisu swirled around him and his pulse lit with adrenaline, the ache in his chest subdued for the moment. A slightly predatory grin slipped onto Ichigo's sharp features and Stark bared his teeth as his own blade howled into the night. With a sparse breath, and the whispers of the wind over sand like an ancient language, the two sprung forward, blades clashing with the jarring snap of metal against metal, sparks lighting the air with the clash. With a hum of Sonido, Stark disappeared, an afterimage lingering in his place, even as Ichigo whirled around Zanjutsu, snapping to attention. Stark's blade whipped overhead to crash against Zanjutsu, the strength of the coyote-like Espada bearing into his arms. Ichigo huffed and his lips pulled back in an imitation of a snarl as he shouldered against the blade, pushing against his arms. The two forces of immense strength weighted against each other. With a whisper of Reisu lingering like the storm in the air, gathering along his sealed blade, Ichigo released a wordless Getsuga Tensho. The bright arc of blazing ebony slammed against Stark's blade, forcing him away as he slid back in the sand, katana diverting the large ripples of power to either side of the Espada, scorching the sand into a crystal mosaic. The captain of the 10th charged forward as the last of the Getsuga Tensho dispersed, Zanjutsu clashing against Stark's blade as the Espada grinned at Ichigo, eyes alight and alive in a way the normally sedate Espada's eyes never reflected. Ichigo's pulse raced with the same excitement, and every sense felt as if magnified in the face of battle. Stark grunted at the weight of Zanjutsu. The situation reversed for a moment. Before the Espada ducked, dropping to a crouch, he slid back a half step before popping up once more. Ichigo followed the Espada swiftly, Zanjutsu catching against Stark's blade as they shoved against one another for a moment. With a wink and a wolfish grin, Stark dropped his blade from where it was locked against Ichigo's Zanpakuto and swiftly brought it up again, swinging out to the side and in towards Ichigo's neck, the air singing with the movement. Zanjutsu snapped up to the side as Ichigo slid into a low stance, their blades clashing with a jarring wail. The two opponents stared one another down for a tense moment before Ichigo dropped Zanjutsu and in the next moment let the blade fly upwards to clash with Starkey's katana. They exchanged a rapid flurry of blows, metal flowing from one movement to the next as Ichigo dodged a swift overhead strike and responded with a slash to the unprotected Espada's side. Starkey ripped around catching the tip of Zanjutsu on his blade as they slid against each other, edging closer to Starkey's torso before the Espada slipped away with a burst of Sonido and launched a wordless zero. The bright blue energy cut through the night like a comet as Ichigo caught the force of it on his blade, holding it only for a moment before he ducked and whipped around to face Starkey, who appeared with a familiar hum, katana slicing in a clear jab. Ichigo stepped in close to the Espada's defense, catching the blade and sliding forward. Starkey growled at the tactic and halted Zanjutsu with his hand, arrow preventing any deep cut even as Ichigo's Zanpakuto released a thin line of crimson. At the sign of first blood, the battle seemed to rise in intensity as they continued to trade blow after blow. Ichigo sliced forward only to take a step back as Starkey's katana cut a clear path towards his chest. The young captain dodged and whipped around Zanjutsu singing as it cut through the air. Up, left, to the right, sliding through the sand, dodge, move forward. It became a near-endless mantra inside Ichigo's mind as they continued to fight, centering himself only in the battle, the feel of Zanjutsu in his hands, the bite of his muscle, and the feel of opponent. Their katanas cut through the air with increasing skill as the two opponents moved in a lethal dance where it felt as if each move was preordained and yet unknown. The captain of the 10th let out a hiss as Starkey scored a gash on his bicep, the sting of the colt mild even as Ichigo retaliated, kicking out at the Espada and releasing a small Getsuga Tensho. Starkey dodged the two attacks, the Getsuga Tensho clashing with the far wall as the Espada straightened katana alert at his side. Standing half a pace from Ichigo, the two stared each other down, their breaths loud and mingling in the night air as tired grins surrendered their features and Reisu whipped about them. Lilynette wordlessly stood from her place in the shadows, studying the two with an expression Ichigo couldn't name but was some like mix of fondness and annoyance. She glided to Starkey and traded a silent look with the first Espada. Ichigo tugged on Zanjutsu, felt the Ryutsu that was as much Ichigo as it was his spirits gather and pulse, Shiro's bloodlust, and glee, Asen's pleasure at seeing battle as they prepared. The two opponents nodded once at each other in wordless agreement, and their Reisu skyrocketed in bright spirals of the sky and the night as Ichigo released his Shikai, and Starkey his resurrection. Zanjutsu's dual blades slipped comfortably into Ichigo's hands, Reisu pulsing and vibrating along his arms, as across from him Starkey rolled his shoulders, fur ruffling in the breeze as the Espada cocked his guns, loud and tremulous in the silence. Starkey grinned once, feral and challenging as the guns in his hands rose and were pointed firmly at Ichigo. Then gunshots rang through the air, loud and bright, as the vast array of bullets of Reisu charged towards Ichigo. Dodging under the first bullet, Ichigo charged forward, deflecting each bullet off of Zanjutsu's smaller blade and the outside of Shiro's blade as he moved closer to the Espada. Starkey increased the rain of fire so that it fell like a hailstorm around Ichigo as he paused in his charge, letting Zanjutsu weave and whirl around him, stopping the sea of zero in their path. Starkey charged forward as Ichigo defended against the rain of fire, continuing with his hail of bullets as he moved in circles around Ichigo trying to attack his unprotected back. Ichigo watched the after images of the Coyote Espada carefully as he whipped around and Zanjutsu sung in his hands, before with a grin Zanjutsu locked into an X formation and he released a Getsuga Jujisho. The large crescents of Reisu slammed into the Espada, who let out a rough growl as his guns crossed over his chest to deflect some of the force of the attack as Starkey slid back in the sand at the force of Ichigo's Reisu. The captain of the 10th gave the first Espada no time to recover from the attack as he charged forward. From the curtain of sand, Starkey stepped forward and caught both of Zanjutsu on the beams of Reisu that jutted from his guns. The two opponents strained against one another before Ichigo released the trench knife portion of Zanjutsu and swept the blade to the side on a path towards Starkey's neck. The Espada growled and leaned back, even as one of the beams of light disappeared and at point-blank range, Starkey sent out a hail of Reisu. Zanjutsu's longer blade rose to catch the hail of bullets even as Ichigo stepped forward against the immense force, the arrow catching some of the stray bullets even as others left thin gashes. A Getsuga Jujisho ripped through the sea of Reisu and slammed into Starkey, who caught the assault with a snarl, eyes flashing gold, the hollow ducked and charged the hum of Sonido drifting listlessly in the air as the espada circled around Ichigo before homing in on his right. Ichigo caught the espada's blades against his own, only to hesitate momentarily as the howling of wolves echoed into the night, and the spiritual creatures appeared around them. Stark took advantage of the momentary pause and pushed forward, even as the wolves surrounding Ichigo leapt forward. Launching a rapid burst of Getsuga Jujisho around himself, Ichigo deflected Stark's rapid swift movements, Zanjutsu shifting in his hands, as he reversed the trench knife and stabbed a wolf, careful to avoid the ones with Lilynet's conscious. Reisu exploded surging upwards into the air, billowing around Ichigo, even as Stark thrust forward once more. They engaged in another quick flurry of blows, blades sliding against one another as the two opponents whirled around each other, Shiro's blade snapping forward even as Asun's blade swept up to defend against Stark's thrust forward. Stark batted aside the strike, shifting fluidly to the side before whirling with a grave and deadly grace to slash both blades towards Ichigo. The orange-haired Shinigami ducked and pivoted, thrusting from his lower position with the trench knife even as the longer blade whipped around. Stark twisted in midair, catching the longer blade with one of his own as he dodged the trench knife, and his eyes flashed. Ichigo let out a hiss of pain as a wolf latched onto his extended arm and began glowing. Across from the orange-haired Shinigami, Stark smirked, breath leaving his lungs in great heaving gasps. Ichigo had only a second to tighten his arrow before the glowing, almost transparent wolf exploded, obliterating the sands around him and sweeping over Ichigo. The captain of the 10th stumbled out of the explosion, Shiakusho a bit seared, and his skin a bit worse for wear. Ichigo pushed the minor injuries aside as he funneled his Reisu around him, letting it spark upon the air. He sent an overpowered Getsuga Jujisho towards Stark, who flinched, eyes a touch wide with shock even as the hollow braced for the attack and the wolves surrounding Ichigo all charged at once. Ichigo grinned in a vaguely bring it on motion. He sliced and whirled, slicing through the wolves as they exploded left and right around him, Zanjutsu singing in his blood and humming in his mind, as if they were one movement. The captain turned instinctively and caught Stark's blade where it slammed into Ichigo's own, an excited laugh bursting from Ichigo's eyes as the final stretch of the battle drew on in a literal storm of blades. They moved across the sand back and forth, near two pinpricks of light, blades whipping overhead, to the side, as they spun, dodged, and forced their blades against one another. In a quick movement Ichigo slid under Stark's open defense, and while Shiro's large blade held Stark's two blades at an impasse, Asun's trench knife snapped forward to rest lightly against Stark's neck. The Coyote Espada chuckled, the noise rough with exertion as their panting filtered into the air, and their eyes glowed. With a nod, Stark surrendered and Ichigo lowered Zanjutsu's blades and stepped back. With a slow drawn-out motion he sealed his Zanpakuto and analyzed his wounds. There were more than a few scrapes, a collection of bites, and a spattering of bruises, but Ichigo was certain he would survive. Stark across from Ichigo took a deep breath and glanced at their surroundings. After a minute Ichigo followed the Espada's example and observed the glass curved into mosaics around them, the deep holes and mountains where the sand had been displaced. Ichigo let out a soft chuckle at the sight and after a moment sunk to his knees, settling into a cross-legged position. Stark observed Ichigo with a roll of his eyes before he padded over, still all lethal grace, and plopped beside Ichigo with a huff and a small bark of laughter. Lilynet re-emerged into existence a moment later, with a crack like a garganta. The second half of the first Espada studied the two of them with accusing eyes, amusement hidden beneath it all, but sat on the sand as well. Their breaths mingled the night air as Ichigo let his senses drift to check on his fellow Shinigami and their opponents. "Anyone dead?" Stark asked casually and nonchalantly, already knowing what Ichigo was doing. The orange-haired Shinigami shook his head and responded, "Only Baragon." The two shared a look followed by a grin and let the silence linger as Shiro's happiness vibrated through Ichigo's system in warm waves, and the ache of his muscles and the quiet of Hueco Mundo surrounded them. X. Chapter 55, Kairos. X. Ichigo entered the throne room silently and like a wraith, as the Suteiko sheathed Ryujin with an elegant movement, and the hiss of metal meeting scabbard. Fires crackled about the room, lingering but dwindling ever steadily as the scent of ash settled like a winter morning over the occupants. The captain of the 10th observed the throne room in careful detail, noting the devastation with a keen eye, the scorch marks lining the walls, the pieces of stone that had been rendered to dust, the ash that collected and billowed about the air like particles of sand, and across from the Suteiko the charred unrecognizable corpse of the king of Hueco Mundo. The Suteiko turned at Ichigo's presence, slowly as if stepping out of the mindset battle, out of the focus on only one's opponent, to observe Ichigo. The myriad of wounds decorating the younger captain's skin like a warning, or a marking, and after a moment his gaze swept past Ichigo to the first Espada and Lilynet lingering in the hallway. The Suteiko himself bore a few observable wounds, most notably the lack of the old man's left arm. Fate had a strange sense of humor, Ichigo knew. Stark, behind the orange-haired Shinigami, observed the destruction of the throne room, where he leaned against the wall, with wide eyes, something close to awe hidden there even as the Espada raised his arms in the universal gesture of peace and surrender. The Suteiko narrowed his eyes at the Espada, the fire of a warrior still blazing merrily in those ancient depths before he looked to Ichigo assessing the young captain. The orange-haired Shinigami understood the question in those eyes, asking if the Espada was trustworthy, asking in part if Ichigo had made the right decision in allowing the Espada to live. Ichigo nodded once, clear and sharp, allowing his determination to burn in his own eyes, flickering and growing even as it overcame the exhaustion that seeped into his system, digging cold claws into his thoughts and limbs. The old man nodded once in response, the trust between the two leaders of Soul Society ringing true and reflecting their many years of companionship. The Suteiko turned his attention away from the first Espada lingering in the doorway and instead to the still smoldering corpse. Something briefly sorrowful passed over Yamamoto's features before it was gone in the next moment, and the silence was only pierced by the crackle of the fires burning out. The tense and somewhat awkward air that lingered was swept away in one moment, only to return with even greater force when Haribel appeared as if a shadow from one corner of the room. She glided forward, still holding every measure of lethality and grace, even if it was apparent she was still injured from her battle against Toshiro, Kion, and Yukatake, in the manner of her walk and the tired mantle that clung to her shoulders. Two of her fraction followed behind her, quiet and diminished as if recognizing the serious aura of the moment that hung in the balance. The future was weighted by everyone's next move. The second Espada halted when she reached the center of the room, keen sea eyes glancing first to Ichigo, and then Stark, who had stepped half out of the shadows at the appearance of his comrade. Lilynet beside the Coyote Espada studied the throne room with obvious interest. After a silent moment of inaudible conversation between the two remaining Espada, Haribel glanced down at the corpse near her feet with obvious distaste, even as it began to crumble to ashes, the last dregs of Baragon's corrosive residue dissipating with the body. Finally, the female Espada glanced into the eyes of the Suteiko, firm and silent, open in a way that purposefully betrayed the intentions of the Hollow and allowed the Suteiko to glimpse whatever he needed to see to ascertain the future of Los Noches. The two studied each other in the silence, a lingering sort of dragging silence that weighed on all occupants of the room, as they continued to stare, assessing each other in a wordless game of chess. Ichigo shifted slightly in the tense silence as his muscles reminded him of his injuries, and gently he started a healing Kido, mind racing to map out all the plausible situations in front of them, and if possible how to prevent the diarrhea of outcomes. The Suteiko had the chance to recognize the Espada as future allies, or at least a faction of their own power capable of ruling Hueco Mundo and controlling the many Espada, one that would aid in the inevitable return of the Quincy. Ichigo had planted the seeds in all the minds of the captains, the humanity, and intelligence of many of the Espada, which had only been aided by their own encounters, the lack of death on the battlefield, and the opponents they faced. Ichigo had also spoken, suggested lightly, to the Suteiko of such peace, but he knew he had no power to command the man who had ruled the Godii 13 for centuries of tradition, nor could one man sway the traditions and decision of another. Still, Ichigo half prayed that the old man would not let the past influence this decision, as if the Suteiko choose to execute or condemn the remaining Espada it would set a precedent for the future of Soul Society, an example for the continued bloodthirsty Godii 13. And if that decision was made, then Ichigo would not simply stand by and let many of the Espada, some who he considered friends, and many who had great potential, be executed for a simple phobia of those different from the Shinigami and the incessant need to follow those with greater power that ran throughout both societies. Ichigo had been on the bad side of Soul Society before, a traitor to those he fought for, and he wouldn't throw away his own ideals to protect himself, not when he was capable of tearing out the corrupt roots by his own hand. A part of Ichigo knew that the Suteiko knew the facets of Ichigo's personality very well, Most of the Goti I-13 had come to recognize that above all Ichigo protected his own, and it was unlikely, therefore, that Tsuteiko would fall to such drastic actions. Though it left the captain of the 10th wondering if the old man could truly accept the changes to soul society it would bring, the idea of Espada entering the court of pure souls and conversing with the enemy that had existed for centuries. As his ribs twanged in reminder of their more than bruised state, Ichigo let his attention drift to the problems closer at hand. He could sense, as he extended his Reisu, that Byakuya and Ulquiorra had finished battling, though the result of such a battle Ichigo could not detect beyond the scope that they were both still alive and likely injured. Shinji and Grimmjow were close to finishing their battle, Reisu erratic and fading in a violent fury. Ichigo knew with little doubt that they would both likely be heavily injured. The attention of the med barracks would likely be needed in due consequence. The poor healers would likely survive high rates of exhaustion-induced fainting, and that wasn't to discount the battle that had occurred outside of Hueco Mundo. A battle which was now quiet where his senses searched, quiet but for the wail of the wounded, and the parting of the dead. As if thinking of the battle had drawn a summons, from the left of the room an Espada entered, disturbing the intense staring match that had continued to draw on as if planning to extend for a century. Neliel entered with blood matting her teal hair, and a few cuts peeking out of the white of her uniform, presence loud and blaring like a fallen star. The 4th Espada observed the damage to the throne room with careful calculating eyes, roving over the gathered Shinigami and Espada before landing on Ichigo with a small smile breaking through the cold ice of her exterior before it disappeared once more as her gaze landed on Haribel and the Tsuteiko. The forces of Hueco Mundo have surrendered on the battlefield. The 4th Espada announced simply, attention straying to meet Haribel as the de facto leader of the Espada. While Starkey was powerful, he was no leader and would never want to be one. The 2nd Espada commanded respect, and her mantle was that of respect and honor for all that she was a hollow. Haribel nodded once, expression twisting minutely in displeasure or sadness at the predictable turn of the war before her gaze slid to the Tsuteiko and she stated, the forces of Los Noches surrender and wish for negotiation. The statement lingered and shifted around the room like the final strike of a battle, as the last of Baragon crumbled to dust, echoing the failing of the past and the promise of rebirth if given chance. The two once more observed each other in silence, and in the dreadful quiet Neliel glided across the room to stand near Ichigo. Her familiar gaze studied Ichigo and in extension Starkey, a hand reaching out to trace faintly over a cut lining Ichigo's cheek. She nodded once, smile soft and sure before she drifted to speak with Lilynet, the two having struck a kinship as the few females within the vast palace. Soul Society consents to a negotiation. The Tsuteiko responded quietly, ancient voice resounding throughout the room, like the ancient war drums calling its soldiers home. Ichigo straightened to attention where he stood, as beside him the Espada mirrored the motion. Haribel looked once more to the old man, eyes swimming with the depths of the seas and all its ancient otherworldly sense, and nodded her acceptance. The Tsuteiko repeated the motion once respectful and proud before he turned to Ichigo and made a small gesture with his hand beckoning the young captain forward. Before we can begin negotiations, all members of both parties that have engaged in battle should be seen to. The old man commanded, voice ringing with authority as Ichigo crossed the cracked ornate tiling of the throne room. Neliel at the mention of battle stepped forward and received a nod of permission from Haribel. The younger Espada stated, the battle on the sands of Los Noches has concluded and both sides have retreated to take care of injuries and casualties. The forces of Soul Society are camped outside of the wall of Los Noches, and our legions are currently gathered inside the lower barracks. The two leaders of the opposing factions nodded, absorbing the information with graceful yet mournful countenances at the thought of the casualties, and the idea of a continued war. The new leader of Hueco Mundo glanced once to the Tsuteiko as if to ascertain permission to give orders to her subordinates. The old man beside Ichigo nodded once slowly as if the movement was pulled from him, though Ichigo could see the old man was somewhat amused by it all. Direct our forces that we have surrendered and are negotiating terms of agreement. Haribel commanded and received a sharp nod from the 4th Espada, who waved briefly once to Ichigo before she disappeared in a hum of sonido. In the lingering silence of the command for surrender, Yamamoto turned to face Ichigo, staring into the younger Shinigami's eyes, searching for something unamiable before he commanded, Ichigo, please go and recover Hirako Teiko and Kukaki Teiko. He paused momentarily to glance at Haribel, who bowed her head and responded, Dear Haribel. The Tsuteiko nodded at the name and continued, If Haribel-san is agreeable and Espada may accompany you to recover her allies. Inherent pleasure sparked in cold eyes at the Suteiko's command, and the open start to negotiations he provided by placing the two on equal footing. Ichigo bowed slightly and nodded, turning to Starkey, who rolled his eyes but mimicked the action, trading a glance with the shark-like queen of Hueco Mundo, who smiled sharp and thin but nodded. Ichigo, if you have the chance, please inform our outside forces of our current status. The Suteiko commanded softly, eyes smoldering and sure, placing as always his trust with the captain of the 10th. Ichigo nodded and added the task to his mental checklist and rolled his shoulders, attempting to drag out the last of his energy. The finish of a battle, of a war, was just as tasking as the actual fight, if not more so for all the administration. Ichigo knew it heavily from experience. Ichigo glanced once more at the decrepit throne room of Los Noches, and in the center tier Haribel, silent and strong like a stone statue bearing the weight of the future, and across from the female Espada, the Suteiko standing ancient and wise, a guardian of the past and a sword for the future. Then Ichigo turned and nodded to Starkey, and the two exited the throne room through the large ornate doors torn off their hinges, leaving the old man surrounded by the remnants of Hueco Mundo's most powerful. Starkey turned to Ichigo once they were out of the watchful gaze of the throne room and gestured for the orange-haired Shinigami to lead the way. Ichigo rolled his eyes and murmured about lazy Espada even as his senses searched for the closest pair of fighters, his muscles protesting the thought of yet more Shunpo. Locking on to Shinji's presence in the east quarter of the vast palace, sated yet tinged with the familiar sense of pain, Ichigo shared a quick glance with Starkey, who was murmuring to Lilynet in patient warm tones. The Coyote Espada glanced upwards and nodded. Ichigo took the gesture as acceptance, and with a shake of his head and a pull of his Ryotsu, Ichigo disappeared in a quick burst of Shunpo, moving through near endless white halls. As they traversed the ground swiftly, mere after images and blurs of color, through the halls of Los Noches, Ichigo wondered how this would change everything. It was easy to draw out an elaborate plan and try to account for every whim and will of fate, but to actually see things in action was a far different sport. There had simply been no absolute guarantee that Soul Society would accept the Espada for having near-human consciousness and intelligence, that the Central 46 wouldn't once more dig their old gnarled claws where they didn't belong, or that some great casualty wouldn't appear. There still wasn't a whole chance that Soul Society would accept the Hollows, at least not for the general souls of the afterlife. But many of the captains seemed open to the idea, something Ichigo had half hoped for, half orchestrated. Then there were questions about how everything would change. The Vizard had been slowly accepted in Soul Society after years, even with complaints, nothing had changed, and the powerful captains and lieutenants had remained. But to invite Espada, full Hollows into Soul Society was unlikely. The young captain wondered if it would be something like distant associates, acknowledging each other's existence and worth, policing their own forces and relying on one another only in dire times. The idea of Soul Society and Hueco Mundo working together to form a semi-cohesive unit was a strange idea, but the bonds forged in fighting weren't easily broken, even those against one's opponent. Ichigo was a connoisseur of that philosophy. And Ichigo knew with no shred of doubt that many of the more bloodthirsty captains and Espada would enjoy the chance to battle new opponents even in a friendly setting, training in new ways, and preparing, even if they didn't know it, for the Blood War. It was still all so uncertain, and something about not knowing the future for once was a strange amalgamation of worry and elation mixing in Ichigo's chest. The idea that the future had been changed for the better was fully cemented in the outcome of their negotiations. Ichigo pulled away from his thoughts as they arrived at one of the larger training areas in the East Wing, Starkey startling to a halt behind Ichigo with a muted huff. Shaking out the kinks in his muscles, Ichigo studied the wild ambient Reisu saturating the place as he walked through the entryway, passing a sort of barrier sail had developed to prevent great portents of Reisu leaking into the rest of the building. The training area was an utter wreck, marble-like rubble littering the ground in large piles like tiny mountains, with scorch marks, and large gashes adorning them every so often. The area was much like Ichigo and Starkey's own battlefield, though with far greater amounts of damage. Surveying the room once more, Ichigo's gaze landed on two figures sprawled on the ground a fair distance away from each other. Grimjo's electric blue hair peeked out from the sand on the far right of the large room, where the skies of Hueco Mundo had watched the two combatants. To the left, Ichigo spotted a familiar head of blonde and the glint of Sakandar resting in the sand. Trading an equally bemused and exasperated glance with Starkey, the two split off towards their respective comrades, Lilynet lingering by the doorway with a slightly bemused but more or less annoyed expression. Shinji was lying on his back, breath leaving his lungs slow and drawn out as if the blonde was savoring each breath as proof of living. There were cuts dancing throughout his shiakusho, blood leaking sluggishly from the many wounds, and a cut over Shinji's left brow and across his eyelid forced the blonde's left eye closed as he blearily blinked up at Ichigo with mute surprise and exhaustion plain across his features. "Hey Ichi!" The captain of the fifth greeted with a racking cough, even as through the one opened eye Ichigo could see a deep-seated content. The battle had obviously been something close to a draw, though Ichigo found it likely that Shinji had won. When Ichigo had battled Grimmjow those first few times, excluding the first brutal beatdown, they had been near equally matched, in skill and power, but Shinji had years of experience, and while his Shikai was certainly something he wouldn't employ to the full extent in his battle, Shinji could still whip out a Zero as easy as any espada. Rolling his eyes at the croaked greeting and the state of his friend, Ichigo's eyes roved around the sands till they landed on Sakanda lying innocently in the sand, blood still coating the elegant blade. Observing his friend in careful measuring silence, Ichigo dropped to his knees and careful-shouldered Shinji onto his back. The blonde groaned and whined the whole time, but after a minute Ichigo rose to his feet, Sakanda once more sealed in Shinji's sheath, and the blonde hugging Ichigo's back like a koala. Ichigo carefully adjusted the weight of his friend on his back and let healing Kido surge through his fingers where they gripped Shinji as he moved towards the entrance. After another moment, Starkey appeared from behind a mountain of sand, the panther espada slung across his back, knocked out cold, which was a small mercy. "We should bring them back to the main throne room and then search for the others," the captain of the 10th suggested softly, as his gaze observed the training area once more. Starkey nodded, expression calm yet possessing a measure of gravity. He looked to Lilynet murmuring something in a low voice even before he straightened and nodded once more. With a burst of Sonido and Shunpo, the three disappeared from the training room, moving once more through the mirroring halls of Los Noches. When they arrived at the throne room, Haribel and the Suteiko were sitting across from each other on the few remaining chairs in the room, silently speaking in whispers. They paused when Ichigo and Starkey arrived, observing the injured captain and espada respectively with slightly concerned eyes. Ichigo gingerly set Shinji down in a corner of the room to the blonde's mild protest, as Starkey mimed the action, setting Grimmjow a careful distance away. Lilynet studied the two knocked-out opponents with a frown before she plopped down between the two. Ichigo raised a questioning brow at the first espada, who shrugged nonchalantly in answer. The Shinigami assumed she was watching over the two in case they decided to wake up, or that their injuries became critical. Glancing briefly to the Suteiko, Ichigo nodded in respect and acknowledgement before he let his Reisu reach out, returning to Byakuya and Ulquiorra. Starkey shifted on his feet beside Ichigo, and wordlessly the two departed from the throne room in a blur of Shunpo. The ever-watching moon of Hueco Mundo hovered over Ichigo's shoulder as he landed in the sands on the outskirts of Los Noches. The desert around them was a pock-marked mess of crystallized glass and deep trenches almost biting into the marrow of the land. As Ichigo observed the scenery, Starkey whistled in surprise behind the captain and murmured, "It's always the quiet ones." Ichigo chuckled at the comment even as his heart palpitated with familiar worry as he spotted the gleam of Kenseiken in the moonlight, Kenseiken he knew better than his own Haori. Sharing a brief nod with Starkey, Ichigo schemed swiftly over the sands and alighted beside Byakuya, collapsed in the sand staring at the sky idly with a somewhat serene expression. The Kukaki head blinked slowly at the younger captain's presence before his gaze centered on Ichigo, and a smile broke the cold indifference of the Kukaki mask. Rolling his eyes in fondness, Ichigo rested a warm palm on his partner's cheek and observed the myriad of cuts decorating his partner. At first glance nothing seemed critical, all the wounds regulated to cuts sluggishly bleeding, but as Ichigo inspected Byakuya's torso he noticed a large gash. "Who's the reckless idiot now?" Ichigo questioned as he shifted aside Byakuya's Shiakusho and began a rough healing Kido to stop the bleeding. It was of course completely logical that Shinji and Grimmjow would suffer only the critical injury of major blood loss, and Byakuya would have a scar that near mirrored the one Ichigo had received in one of his own battles against the 4th Espada, and luckily not the battle where he rose from the dead. Byakuya laughed weakly before it broke into a hacking cough, painting his lips with blood. Ichigo painted his partner with a pointed stare even as he contemplated the safest way to return the injured captain to the throne room. As if sensing Ichigo's train of thought, very likely with how similar a wavelength they resided on. Byakuya rolled his eyes and shifted so that his arms circled around Ichigo's neck. Spoiled noble. The older captain teased lightly as he carefully lifted Byakuya into his arms. The Kukaki scoffed at the insult and replied, weak but fond, insufferable Shiba. Ichigo scoffed at the insult with a warm smile even as the captain of the 6th attempted to maintain a stoic facade, failing as to be expected. Ichigo chuckled silently and earned a small mutinous glare from his partner, as if blaming Ichigo for his situation. Ichigo just winked and turned to face Los Noches, the monstrous stone beast shining in the moonlight. Muttering to himself as Ichigo's arms berated him for the extended work, Ichigo returned to Starkey, who was waiting by one of the entrances to Los Noches, a familiar apathetic espada slung across his back. Starkey raised a brow at the sight of Ichigo carrying the captain of the 6th in his arms, and the older captain half expected the coyote to whistle again. But the sloth-like espada just shrugged and turned away after sharing a nod and a wink with Ichigo. Once more the two arrived in the throne room, and Ichigo spared a brief glance with the Suteiko as he gently set Byakuya down beside Shinji, using the Kukaki's Haori as a sheet. Semi-content with the state of the two captains, Ichigo straightened and announced clearly, I'm going to report the news of surrender to our forces and fetch a healer. Receiving nods of agreement, Ichigo pivoted on his heel, flashed Starkey a smile, eyes holding some desperate promise to watch their lives, and disappeared in a burst of shunpo. Silently Ichigo wanted the long day to draw to a close, but he knew the negotiations would likely continue long into the night, and that wasn't to discount the continuation of negotiations that would occur in Soul Society afterwards among all members of each party. He could already feel the coming headache, not to mention the paperwork it would all bring no matter what decision was reached. Landing in the middle of the newer camp, perched on the outskirts of Los Noches' towering walls, Ichigo ignored the hush whispers of the Shinigami surrounding him, eyes sweeping over the myriad of wounded soldiers being attended to by the 4th Division members. His senses searched for Kensei and Renji, the actual leaders with some semblance of sanity, as opposed to the ever-insane Kenpei. Ichigo cut through the camp, an imposing figure, with haste ushering his steps, and exhaustion lining his brow and hooding his eyes. Distantly he acknowledged he was likely a grim figure, but the thought was swept aside as Ichigo spotted the command tent. Through the open flaps of the tent, Ichigo spotted Renji leaning over a map, Kensei beside the redhead, the two sharing equally serious looks. Striding into the tent without pause, Ichigo nodded briefly to the Shinigami stationed on the outside even as he flared his presence, drawing the attention of the two pseudo-generals. Ichigo. They greeted in unison, worry and a mixture of other emotions caught in the syllables of his name. The captain of the 10th nodded briefly in greeting, something warm in his gaze before it was gone in the face of duty, and he replied, the forces of Hueco Mundo have surrendered. For now, focus on healing the wounded, and preparing for a return to Soul Society. Currently, the Suteiko is negotiating with Tyr Haribal, the new ruler of Hueco Mundo. The two remained in stunned silence for a moment, before grim determination steeled their features and they nodded. Renji made an aborted movement to leave the tent, but before he could move, Ichigo placed a hand on his shoulder, halting the motion, and said in a somewhat kinder tone, I'm going back to Los Noches and will be returning with a healer. When you feel you can spare one of you, feel free to check in, we will be in the throne room. The negotiations could very well take all night. Best of luck then, Ichigo. Renji replied to the news with a wry twist of his lips and a serious glint to his eyes as he patted Ichigo on the shoulder and swept out of the tent, all the bearing of a captain hanging off of his shoulders. Kensei nodded once at Ichigo, conveying his understanding without words, and dismissing the orange-haired captain to continue on his mission. Ichigo bowed and darted out of the camp, Reisu sweeping out to search for a semi-familiar presence. He knew Isane would likely still be busy with the majority of vastly critical wounds the Shinigami on the field had suffered. But Ichigo was certain he and another healer could manage to stabilize the captains and Espada in a decent fashion. The captain moved swiftly around the camp, following a trail of Reisu, even as he left after images like a ghost of his passing. Ichigo only slowed when he found the Shinigami he was looking for, hunched over one of the Shinigami of the 7th Division. The 4th Division member was wrapping a wound and applying a light healing Kido, all the while lecturing the Shinigami in front of him to stop being a baby. Hanataro. Ichigo greeted softly, still surprising the always jumpy Shinigami as the healer spun around with wide eyes, only to settle when he saw Ichigo. The healer studied the captain with an admonishing look at the many wounds visible all over Ichigo's body, even as the captain ignored the demanding gaze and asked, "Hanataro, can you come with me? Hirako Teiko and Kukaki Teiko need healing." The demure Shinigami glanced back at the division Shinigami, watching the scene play out with wide eyes before he turned once more to face Ichigo, raising a brow in insinuation at Ichigo's own state even as he rose and nodded. Ichigo grinned, small and a bit brittle, but a grin nonetheless. Hanataro, under the careful guidance of Anohana, had grown a spine and developed as a healer, learning to use what power he held to his full capability, and his role on the battlefield had only strengthened that skill. He would never be as powerful or precise as Anohana or Isane, but he was skilled. Hanataro sighed and with a pointed glance at his former patient locked onto Ichigo's arm, already well familiar with the orange-haired captain. Shaking his head, Ichigo gently tugged Hanataro with him into the shunpo as the land blurred around him, merging into the white of Los Noches, and a near second later the throne room. The young healer swayed on his feet for a moment, sending a small timid glare at Ichigo for the fast and somewhat dizzying travel before his attention fell to the patients and the healer was off on a mission. Sparing the Suteiko and Haribel a brief glance, still locked in conversation, Ichigo drifted towards Grimjo, breath still light and airy, barely enough force to move a feather, and settled beside the hyperactive Espada. Ichigo lost himself in the healing Kido, healing only the major wounds to the best of his ability, even as Hanataro tossed him a roll of gauze and mechanically Ichigo wrapped the Panther Espada's wounds almost in a near trance before repeating the process with Ulquiorra. After an extended period of silence filled only by the hum of Zanjutsu and his own mind, Ichigo tipped back onto the balls of his feet, and cracked his neck, observing his handiwork with a critical eye before he nodded, assured his patients would survive the night. Slowly Ichigo rose to his feet, attention drifting to Byakuya assessing his state as he glided towards the Suteiko. The old man glanced up as Ichigo settled gingerly on the floor beside him, something warm in the Suteiko's gaze full of pride and maybe fondness as the Suteiko leaned over and stated quietly, "We have agreed to a cessation of hostilities, and will be convening upon future meetings to work out the details, but have defined that the Espada will stay out of the mortal realm. They will be allowed access to Soul Society with given permission from a captain, so also does that apply to a captain visiting Los Noches. Haribel-san will hold the position of ruler and will continue to guide the forces of Hueco Mundo." The Suteiko finished with a rumble, voice quiet and gentle in the lingering silence of the throne room. Ichigo nodded, expression brightening at the news as he glanced briefly, from under the mess of his fringe, up at Haribel, who smiled, something less predator and more genuine, obviously happy with the negotiations so far, and the equal playing field. Leaning against the chair, Ichigo listened to the Suteiko and Haribel continue to talk, discussing members of either faction allowed in either dimension at any one time. Peacefully Ichigo let his senses drift to his comrades, assessing his partner's health before he turned his attention inwards and began a healing Kido of his own, his hope for the future something nourished and growing as the world moved on around him. The vast hall that served as the room for the captain's meetings lingered and pulsed with an invisible tension, draped over each occupant of the room, as an endless sea of eyes watched everyone's movement. One whisper of a sword against sheath, one hint of agitation in the Reisu swelling and filling the room like the essence of space, would snap that precious tension and give way to something all the more furious. Wordlessly Ichigo shifted, attempting to displace the tension that clung to his shoulders as his gaze surveyed the room. Opposite Ichigo was a line of Espada, those who were not injured or dead, standing silent and alert in the territory of their greatest enemy. Stark across from Ichigo was a silent statue, posture betraying the fear and worry that crept like a predator between both forces. Gathered on Ichigo's side was the Shinigami, watching their opponents with the same concerned worry and awareness. There were only 9 Shinigami facing the 7 Espada, a few of the captains still in the caring presence of the 4th as both sides recovered from the war. But it was perhaps for the best that both sides weren't at full power. Ichigo hit a minute shudder at the thought of the 4th, he had managed to avoid it for the most part, but he would have to visit Byakuya soon, the poor Kukaki captain still trapped as he recovered from his battle with Ulquiorra. It was only through impressive luck and wit that he had evaded Anohana's hawk-eyed search so far. At the end of the impressive line of ascendant forces of catastrophic power, the Suteiko and Haribel stood, opposite one another in a complete silence. A sheet of paper settled between the two on a simple wooden table that Kojiro had brought in at the start of the meeting. The paper held an air about it, for all that it held little power as of yet, the ink printed onto the long sheet of rice paper glinting in the oil lamp's light. The treaty was that similar to a peace treaty, listing the following terms of agreement between the forces of Hueco Mundo and Seoul Society. It declared a state of peace between the upper echelon of Hueco Mundo and the GODI-13, while acknowledging that Hollow would continue to exist and follow instinct regardless of who led them, and that the Shinigami would still patrol the human world in Rungokai to dispatch such creatures. It also set rules and regulations, paperwork, for when an Espada was permitted to visit Seoul Society, in times of Great War as an aide, at the request of a captain, and in case of a severe emergency, and how it applied to the Shinigami in the same manner. The general idea behind the treaty was the strengthening of both sides and the idea of strengthening the bond of kinship between the Shinigami and the Espada. Seoul Society did not crave war, as much as Hueco Mundo did not crave the extermination of their upper echelon, which was plausible under such a threat. The treaty provided a means of peace between the two forces, and though most did not acknowledge or know it, it had the capability of being the basis upon which the two forces would be united when the Quincy appeared once more, threatening the lives of all living, or not living in the stranger sense. For now, the two forces would attempt to recover from the war, rebuild their infrastructure, where it existed, train in preparation, heal, and recover. All the while Seoul Society would descend once more into a flurry of commotion with the vacuum the war had left, seen as an opening to many. Ichigo resisted the urge to run a hand over his face as he attempted to sort his memories into a cohesive timeline of attempt after attempt to fell the Shinigami. In some ways, he was equal parts dreading and hopeful about the coming attacks. For some, it would open their eyes to the imperfection of Seoul Society, and their own desperate need to improve. In other ways it was a pure nuisance, the endless horde of different opponents attempting to break into Seoul Society, all with 1,000 different problems and revenge problems. Ichigo shook aside thoughts of the near future and the heavy weight that settled behind his chest at the thought of how close it all was, time flying on swift winds that took his feet from beneath him and refocused on the Suteiko. The two had spent the past half an hour in muted silence, conversing over the terms of agreement, making absolutely sure everything was as fair as possible with as few loopholes as possible. The first draft of the treaty had been drawn up after the last battle when Renji had appeared sometime in the early morning with paper and exhaustion dragging his heels. He hadn't been the only tired soul in the room. This was, if Ichigo recalled correctly, the fifth draft, after more than a few meetings in the wreck of Los Noches or the same meeting hall they all presided over. The half an hour spent in discussion had lingered with awaited intense silence, and Ichigo couldn't wait for the long meeting to be over. There were many things he would be rather wasting his time with, such as aiding in the repair efforts, managing his division, and subtly preparing Toshiro. Soundlessly, as if at a frequency all in the room could hear, the captains and Espada straightened as the wizened form of the Suteiko, still ever the pillars of the GODI-13, leaned over and signed the sheet. After a moment Haribal repeated the action. There was no great ripple of the treaty being signed, nor Kami descending from above to cement it in the fabric of the universe, but regardless a collective exhale of relief shuddered through the souls present as the peace became official. Ichigo took a breath even as a small honest smile slipped onto his features, something like hope bursting free at the face of it all. Starkey across from Ichigo grinned, a wolfish happy grin. Beside Ichigo, Yukatake smiled warmly, and Ichigo knew there would be celebrations for hours, even as the sun heralded the start of a change, a tangible change as opposed to the endless tales of change, people living others dying, that had molded the future. Check the description for the links to the author.